So let me just maybe introduce the group for those that are joining us for the first time. This is the Apologetics Academy. We run these webinars every Saturday at this time, which is 8 p.m. here in the UK, or 3 p.m. Eastern Time, 2 p.m. Central, or 12 noon Pacific. And we bring in different scholars and speakers and personalities, experts on different topics, representing a range of viewpoints across the theological and philosophical spectrum. We sometimes bring in Christian guests, atheist guests, or even Muslim guests. And this is a Christian group, and as Christians, we believe that if Christianity is actually true, then we don't have anything to fear from it being criticized, and so we don't mind talking to people who don't share our Christian worldview. And so we're delighted this evening to bring in Matt Dillahunty, who's a well-known personality, who's best known for his Atheist Experience TV program, which runs on Sundays. And he's based in Texas. And we're going to be having his wife on, actually, Beth, in a few weeks, talking to us about the pro-choice position on abortion. So we look forward to that as well. And there's a number of ways that you can participate if you are in the audience. You're by default in the viewer section, which means that you're anonymous to most of the participants. There's 4 to 8 people here currently, and you can participate in a number of ways. You can participate in the chat window. If you click on the chat icon at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the chat. You can participate there, and please direct the chat to everyone rather than just panelists. If you're just making general chat, you can submit questions anonymously by hitting the Q&A button, typing a question for Matt to answer. Or if you're feeling brave, you can click raise hand, and then I will promote you to be a co-panelist with Matt, and then you can go back and forth and engage him in that way as well. So, or you can simply listen anonymously and enjoy the program. So Matt, do you want to maybe introduce yourself? Just tell us where you're coming from, your background, and maybe just tell us a little bit about atheism, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, sounds great. First of all, thanks for having me, and thanks to Jonathan for asking. I know my wife had done one of these previously, I think, in addition to coming on a week or so. And I'm Matt Dillahunty. I'm one of the hosts of the Atheist Experience. I'm very happy to be here because I enjoy talking with theists, especially people who are, open to questioning and open to having questions. My TV show, which isn't mine, by the way, it's sponsored by the Atheist Community of Boston. I'm just, one of the hosts. It's a live call-in show, and so if you don't get your question through here today, you're welcome to call into the show tomorrow and ask questions there as well. And for the atheists who showed up here, you can participate at whatever level they want you to, but I think it's probably best that we keep questions coming from theists rather than trailing off into whatever atheist questions. I mean, hell, you can email me or call the show. But background-wise, my parents were Southern Baptists, and my dad's entire family were long-standing Southern Baptists. As a matter of fact, if you trace my lineage back through my dad's family, one of the first Dillahuntys to arrive in the United States formed a church that was one of the first 3 churches, I think, of the Southern Baptist Convention. And so I've got that side of the family has this long history of Protestantism, Southern Baptist primarily, occasionally some Pentecostal stuff, mostly because they had better music, concerts and stuff when I was a kid. Excuse me. My mom's family was a mix of Protestant and Catholics, and my dad's brother was a missionary, and he convinced my mom to, my folks got married in a Methodist church. They really weren't, she was in a Catholic family, he was in a Protestant family, so there's the compromise. The short version, my mom got saved, joined the Baptist church, led many of her Catholic family members to leave the Catholic faith, because Baptists were convinced that Catholicism is a Mary worshiping, saint worshiping cult that is not really Christian. And so I grew up in the church, and about age 5 or so, I walked down the aisle at a revival and accepted Jesus into my heart and prayed the sinner's prayer. And I know my folks were concerned, can a 5-year-old, really get saved? How does this possibly work? And I know they talked to the pastor, and the pastor was like, well, we really don't know. It's in God's hands. You just have to kind of wait and see. But when I was a teenager, I was active in the church all the time, voluntarily. I wasn't forced to go, except some Sunday mornings. I'm not really much of a morning person, and I would be forced to go then. But I actually attended church, more than my parents. I was Sunday morning, Sunday night, Monday night visitation, Wednesday night services, youth group stuff, mission groups, summer camp at Camp Windermere in the Lake of the Ozarks. And yes, I'm fully aware that how much you attend church has nothing to do with, whether or not you're saved or in good standing with God, etc. I just mention it because I was serious about it. I went in part because my friends were there, but also because I believed. And in my teen years, I came to recognize if I'm just beginning to understand, understand the Bible and understand what God wants now, then I couldn't possibly have understood it when I was 5, which means I'm not really saved and I better get saved now. And so I did all of that again. And I'm sure that there were several other times in my teenage years where I would, being a normal teenager, engage in things that I knew I shouldn't have, and my walk with Christ wasn't correct. And so then you do this recommitment, and there's this kind of cycle that takes place that I've talked about before called the guilt cycle. And by the way, when I talk about religion, my purpose isn't to offend people. I'm giving their, my perspective on it. And when I say things like guilt cycle, I don't mean that there's some nefarious section of the church that has as its goal and purpose to perpetuate a guilt cycle. I understand that this is a natural process within at least my church, and a number of other people have mentioned that it was similar, and there is primarily, I think, Protestant churches, where because you can't live up to what you think you're supposed to live up to, there's this constant rededication. Let me get right with God. Let me get right with God. It's the reason why the churches have revivals all the time, because the church body becomes stagnant, and you hear about churches that aren't Christ-like and all these other things. So I participated in that. When I was 18 or so, I left and was in the Navy for about 8 years. And while I was in, I was still a believer for the entire time that I was in. So unfortunately, I can't claim to be an atheist in a foxhole, because I was in for about a little over 8 years. But I didn't attend church while I was in the Navy. And part of that's because in the military, your access to religious education is, they try to make it something for everybody, which means if you're actually serious, if you're actually dedicated to these ideas, you're not going to get what you need out of that. And so it was just easier not to go, and to have private Bible study. But also there was a period of time where I was engaging with people who didn't share my beliefs, people from other religions or no religion, and this was my first big jaunt out into the big wide world. And it was kind of a growing up period, of course, and they joined the Navy, see the world, I did all that, and being exposed to a lot of things that I wouldn't have ever engaged with as, First Baptist Church of Harvester in St. Charles, Missouri. And if I hadn't left home, I probably wouldn't have had those experiences. When I left the Navy, I came to Austin, Texas, because a friend of mine lived here and worked for Dell. I worked in the tech industry for a few years, and then I lost my job and everything. I had been focused on my career and not on God. And what I thought had happened was I had been convinced that God had wanted me to be a preacher, but I was terrified of public speaking, and I didn't want to be a preacher, which is why I ended up running off and joining the Navy. And I wasn't alone. I know that, friends and family members and people in the church were convinced that I had a calling to preach. And so I thought, when I lost my job and everything, this was God punishing me. This was God saying, okay, you've had your fun time. You lived through your teen years, and you kind of mostly didn't think about me as much as you should have. And you certainly weren't living right, and you focused on your career. And now I'm going to take all that away. And so I set out I gave in, and I said, okay, God, if you want me to be a preacher, then that's what I'll do. And that started a period of prayer and study, and with the goal of possibly heading off to college and then ministry, neither of which actually happened. I kind of found my way out, and I've told this story a bunch of times, and I don't want to get into the minutia of my life because I'm not important. It's the ideas themselves are important. So what eventually led me away was a realization that the things that I believed that were just obviously true. I mean, when people call into the show and say, look at the trees, I thought like that. That's the way I looked at it. It was the God I believed in was real, it was evident and obvious. And an investigation into how can we, well, epistemology, basically, how do we know what we know, but a broadened understanding of the burden of proof and a desire to care about whether or not my beliefs were true rather than whether or not they were comforting or popular, led me to a point where I started finding problems with the Bible and the doctrines that I was raised with, which led me to ultimately reject them, to where I couldn't identify as a Christian anymore, even though I might have still identified it as a theist in some sense. And it's okay, what I understand within Christianity isn't true. It doesn't have a good, or it's not demonstrable. There's no good evidence for it. All the reasons that I had for believing are fallacious or based on appeals to faith. But I wanted to find out what could be true, what kind of God might exist. And so I joke that I started exploring world religions, and I started with Buddhism because I wanted to find out if I would have multiple lifetimes to investigate the question, because it's more than anybody can really do. I mean, you can't possibly study in detail every religion of the world and every religion that's existed in order to figure out which one of them might be correct. And so I went into self-guided study of philosophy to figure out how to direct that search, what kind of God might exist. I remember a day when I was driving home from work with my roommate, and I said, I think I'm kind of agnostic now, not really understanding how the terms were used or were best used. But eventually, I just had to recognize I was an atheist. It wasn't a choice that I made. I just did not believe any longer that there was a God. And it's at this point, I've kind of got to make a distinction. Atheism is often divided into a number of different categories. Weak and strong atheism is somewhat popular. Most atheists don't bother saying, oh, I'm a weak atheist or I'm a strong atheist. But I like to clarify that, because what tends to come under attack most frequently is the strong atheist position. The weak atheist position is, I do not believe that a God exists. The strong atheist position is, I believe that gods do not exist. And not everybody immediately grasps the difference between those two statements. And I've used a number of examples. I think because this is sitting with me, I'll go with this one today. So I have a jar that has some hot cinnamon jawbreakers in them. They're probably 5 years old now, so I wouldn't eat them. But we know, from what we know about the world, that the number of gumballs that are in that jar, or jawbreakers that are in that jar, is either even or odd. Those are the only two possibilities if we're talking about whole jawbreakers. You don't got to count into halves. So it's either even or odd. If I say I don't believe the number is even, that doesn't mean that I'm convinced that the number is odd. I could be, or I might not be. And so the weak atheist position is basically saying, I am not convinced, I do not believe that the number is even. The strong atheist position would be, I am convinced that the number is not even, or which logically becomes equivalent to, I believe the number is odd, since those are the only two possibilities. And what confuses people is they say, oh, well, if you don't believe it's even and you don't believe it's odd, then you're agnostic. You're in this middle ground. And I reject that, because atheism and agnosticism are two different issues, because knowledge is a subset of belief. Atheism and theism address whether or not you believe in a God. Some of the strong atheist position has sometimes been called anti-theism as well. I'm not as concerned about the labels. I'm really not. Matter of fact, I think the labels quite often get in the way, because I am a strong atheist with regard to some definitions of God, perhaps not all. And I don't assert that position with absolute certainty. I don't think that absolute certainty is attainable at all. And I'm not saying that with absolute certainty either, for the people who immediately want to jump to that. But based on the gods that have been hypothesized or presented, I don't believe that any of them exist. I have no evidence for it. And in many cases, I think we have good reason to think that they don't exist, that these are fictions invented by people. And one of the reasons for this is, if you follow a particular religion, then you probably, not always, but probably think that the other religions that point to gods that are different from the one you believe in are not true. Otherwise, you would wind up believing them too, and you would end up believing mutually exclusive, contradictory positions. So if you're in this position where you don't believe in all these other gods, it seems strange that when talking to me, for example, when I say I don't believe in any of the gods, people are like, oh, well, that means you believe that no gods exist. Well, yes, depending on your definition. There was a video that got popular a few weeks ago from a preacher who lied and said that he went to Cambridge or someplace like that and debated atheists and showed how they were wrong by drawing a circle and saying, isn't it possible that if this circle represents all the things you don't know, that God is somewhere in that circle? And he presented this, in front of his church as, I have defeated the atheists. And it's embarrassingly bad, which I hope is fairly easy for people to recognize, because people will ask, hey, are you an atheist with regard to gods, for example, that nobody's ever thought about or hypothesized? And I would have to say, I am and I am not, depending on how you want to label things, how you want to qualify things, because I reject the gods that have been presented to me, but how can I infer from all of the gods that I've seen so far don't exist, or I don't believe they exist, therefore no gods exist? That's a fallacy. It would be a version of the black swan fallacy. The problem here is that if there was something about swans, some genetic component about swans that precluded the possibility of a black swan, then it wouldn't be a fallacy, because it's not so much an inference that there are no black swans, but it's a deduction that there are no black swans. That's not the case, by the way. There are black swans. I saw some while we were in Australia. But if I can't say there are no gods absolutely, can I? Well, it depends on what you're going to talk about. I look at the world, and the God label carries some minimal baggage with it. Whether we're talking about the God of classical theism, the omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent type of God, those characteristics seem to conflict with what we know and understand about reality. But the bigger issue here is the barrier to our ability to investigate the supernatural. Now, I know the James Randi Educational Foundation for years had a $1 million prize. If anybody could demonstrate anything paranormal or supernatural, they would win it. And of course, nobody did. But this isn't about saying that the supernatural does not exist, that it's not a real thing. It's a recognition that we cannot confirm that the supernatural exists. And even if we were able to do that, or we had perhaps good reason to suspect along those lines, there's the further problem of confirming that the supernatural can in fact manifest or affect reality in any way. Science is not based on philosophical naturalism, the assertion that the supernatural does not exist. It is based on methodological naturalism. It's a recognition that because we have no mechanism yet to confirm and test and investigate the supernatural, we just don't get to include those things in scientific findings. And I'm not just simply advocating for, scientism and science as the only way to know anything, but I'm pretty much convinced that in our current state, in the world that we live in, science is the single most consistently reliable method of giving an accurate model, an accurate understanding of reality. So if I have no way to confirm the existence of the supernatural, all of the gods that are proposed that are supernatural fit into that, where they at least for the time being have essentially a genetic component that precludes any reasonable belief in their existence. That doesn't necessarily mean that we have a justification to say they don't exist. If people make claims about gods, this God cares about me and wants a relationship with me, well, that God probably doesn't exist, because if I was in a relationship with somebody, I would know it. If there was a desire to have a relationship with me, it hasn't been expressed in such a way where I can grasp it or understand it. And so I do, in fact, believe that there aren't any gods, but that's not a position of absolute certainty. And it's like every other scientific position that one would hold, it is tentative and subject to correction. As soon as somebody provides a way to identify and verify the supernatural, to test that it's real, to show that it can, impact reality, then I would accept that that's the case. Until such time, I have no good reason to think it's true. And when we talk about all of the time that we've spent exploring the world and gaining an understanding of the world, every single time we've found an explanation for something, it has been natural. It hasn't been supernatural. Now, somebody just grabbed their head and screamed and said, but if you preclude the supernatural, of course, you're only going to find naturalistic explanations. Yes, I agree. The problem here is that the only reason the supernatural explanations aren't included is because we have no mechanism. Somebody has to provide a way that we can test and verify and make use of those claims. And because of that, it gets rid of all kinds of things. It gets rid of ghosts and fairies and goblins and magical powers and gods. So I'm an atheist because I don't believe a God exists. I am perhaps an anti-theist in a couple of different ways, because I don't find that religion is particularly beneficial. And before you go pulling your hair out, not so you'll look like me, but out of frustration, I recognize that religious organizations and people who are religious have been hugely beneficial to the world. We have hospitals and schools of higher learning. Christianity, in some elements, was essential to eliminating slavery in the United States. It was also used to support slavery in different varieties. But I'm sorry, I got distracted by something in chat, which I'll have to get back to. But this idea that religions don't do anything good, I'm not convinced that the religions themselves do good. I'm more convinced that people do good on behalf of their religion, perhaps motivated by desires from religion, but that religion isn't necessary to do anything good. As a matter of fact, I used to have a running bet on the show that if somebody could provide a real, tangible demonstration of something that was beneficial, that could only be arrived at through the truth of religion, not through the lie of religion, because you can motivate people to do good things by lying to them. So the fact that they do good things on behalf of that and give credit to their religion doesn't mean that the truth of the religion has in any way been confirmed. So I don't see any benefit to that. And in many ways, I'm opposed to it. I've always said, take the good wherever you find it and get rid of the bad. So if we find good ideas that happen to be a part of some holy book, whether, the Bhagavad Gita or the Quran or the Bible or any of those, if we find good statements in there, they are good because they're good. They're not good because they're in that book. It doesn't matter who says something. If I say something that's wrong, or if I say something that's right, the statements are right or wrong, completely independent of who I am, whether I am me, an ancient book, or a divine being. I've had lots of discussions over the years. I've been hosting the Atheist Experience for about 11 years. I do discussions on the show all the time and debates. They don't always end well. I'm not always the best person for it. I don't have infinite patience. I am occasionally arrogant and condescending. I would hope perhaps not as much as I used to be, but you never know. It depends. But I genuinely enjoy having the conversations. The problem is, if I have a debate on the show and it proceeds down a path where somebody provides the reason why they believe something. Here's what I believe and why. And the why is the important part. And more important than why do they believe it is why should anyone else believe it? You could perhaps have a personal justification. God has revealed to me that it's true. Well, I can't prove that God didn't reveal it to you. And you may, in fact, have a justification for you to believe, but your personal revelation is only hearsay to everybody else, to paraphrase Hume, and it can't be justification for anybody else. And when we follow this path down, eventually, many times we get to just a claim that, well, you have to take this on faith. There are all kinds of things you don't know, and you have to take this on faith. And I am, if anything, the most anti-faith person you're going to run across. And I define faith as the excuse people give for a belief for which they have no good reason. Because if somebody asks you, why do you believe, for example, that the Earth orbits the sun, you don't ever hear anybody talk about taking it on faith. You offer the evidence. Well, we measured this, we measured that, we came to this conclusion, and here's the model that we have. If you ask somebody to demonstrate, well, you can't see air, as if seeing is the only thing. We can actually measure air quality and figure out what particles are in it, and things like that. We can demonstrate gravity, dropping a pen, but that doesn't provide us an explanation for gravity. And so what I find happens quite often with apologists is there's a parade back towards positions of faith. There is a constant search to find the areas where we don't and perhaps cannot currently, and maybe never, have an explanation and claim that they do. The more sophisticated theologians are, for me, I'm sorry, unimpressive. The arguments for the existence of God have been presented and debated. I've debated several times. Blake and I will be debating again in August on the resurrection. And they kind of vacillate in their popularity. You can watch it on the show. You'll see the teleological arguments become popular for a little while, and then they'll fade off, and they'll get a revamp while the next wave of the ontological arguments, cosmological arguments, whatever. And this is where I get back to this position of, even if you had an argument, you still haven't provided any mechanism by which we can confirm the supernatural. If you want to just say that, oh, we got there by an exercise of pure reason, I think that that is where a circle with all the things we don't know is potentially being exploited. The last thing that comes up, or not the last thing, but the last thing I want to mention before we get to questions, is this idea that something is true for me, that truth is subjective. And I've had conversations with people where they end up at the end of it saying, well, I'm not going to be able to convince you, but it's true for me. Well, I reject the idea of truth being subjective. And this, don't get me wrong, there are experiences that I've had that you haven't had. And those experiences are part of my understanding of reality. And so when I say it's true, I also recognize you don't have a good reason to believe this because you weren't there to witness it or experience it. We went to Inks Lake to go camping a couple weeks ago, and I saw 8 snakes. I don't think they were all different species, but they were 8 different snakes. And, some of them were swimming along the water and everything else. If that's something you had never seen before, and it wasn't within the realm of your understanding of what was, reasonable, you might not believe that I saw so many snakes. Or that I saw snakes swimming. I saw people who were surprised, shocked that snakes could swim. And so there are things experientially that I have good reason to believe. And I recognize that other people who don't have those experiences don't have a good reason to believe. This is often used in the it's true for me sense of, well, I've had a personal experience with, the one true God. And this makes my position justifiable. And the problem that I get back to with that is, at that point, when you have experienced something that is outside the realm of what is understood to be real, what method do you have to confirm your personal experience? Because when I see snakes swimming in the water, my process of verifying I'm seeing what I think I'm seeing and not just a stick or a reflection or whatever else is to get independent verification from other people. This is the foundation that science is based on, peer review and replication of falsifiable claims. And when you get to the God thing, the God claims, you have something that's potentially untestable, usually unfalsifiable, isn't subjected to independent review. And while you have millions of people who believe this, they don't necessarily believe the same thing, which is how you get 1,000 denominations that all identify as Christian. Because for some reason, this God that each of them are purportedly getting revelations from doesn't seem to reveal the same things to all of them. In some cases, seems to reveal contradictory information. So when I put all of that together, I don't have any good reason to believe, and I have a number of reasons to disbelieve, to actively think that these are invented fictions, that what we have are attempts by limited beings to explain things in the absence of good information. And so we tell stories and we try to invent explanations because we're uncomfortable with not knowing. You know, I think the best answer you can give is I don't know, because that allows you to go out and look for an answer. So we know this happens. We know people have invented religions. Some of them are more obviously invented than others. But I don't think you need some sort of nefarious, we're going to invent this religion in order to control people. I think this is a natural result of minds that are trying to understand the universe and don't yet understand it. There are fears that we have about death and dying and loss and being alone, fears of the unknown. Those types of things, religions do their best to offer explanations for. The problem is this: the religions that have been very specific about their claims, about saying, you know, Zeus hurls lightning bolts. Well, maybe Zeus does hurl lightning bolts, but we have a naturalistic explanation for it. We can never get to the point where we have confirmed Zeus does not hurl lightning bolts. It's an unfalsifiable claim, because you could just say, well, Zeus works through the physics of the natural world. And when Zeus wants to hurl a lightning bolt, he gathers together clouds and static electricity and creates a differential so that the lightning, which actually goes up, or at least my understanding is it actually goes up, even though that's not necessarily the way it looks. But we have an actual explanation, because we've taken an unknown and we have provided a bunch of knowns that together support this. And you cannot explain a mystery by appealing to a bigger mystery, which is why I say that the God explanations aren't explanations. They have no real explanatory power. They are answers. They are posited responses. Hey, you know, why does this happen? Because God did it. Okay, you've now offered your proposed explanation, but you haven't edified anybody's understanding of the subject. All you've done is basically alleviated the discomfort with not knowing by giving an illusion that you do know. It is one of the most common components of religion, which, by the way, none of this demonstrates that religions are false. And that, by the way, is a shifting of the burden of proof. It's not up to the atheist to demonstrate there are no gods. It is up to the theists to demonstrate that there are. And when their explanations are unfalsifiable, unverifiable, when they are indistinguishable from explanations of other religions that they reject. You know, if I'm a Southern Baptist Christian still, and I'm rejecting Islam, and yet we're both offering the same argument, you know, the Kalam cosmological argument, when we start talking about the origins of the universe, if that can on its own lead to either one, then we haven't done any distinction, even if that argument were correct. And at the end of the day, I'm not convinced, of course, that those arguments are correct, but I understand, or I think I understand, how mankind, humankind, has invented gods, which is not to say that every god is necessarily invented. There's this popular idea amongst believers who are not necessarily tied to maybe spiritual but not religious, which I just did a video about, that all religions have somehow touched on some truth but gotten it kind of wrong. That there's something out there that it just doesn't feel right to us, that there's not something out there who cares about us or created the universe or started it off. And so they've all kind of reached in and maybe touched on some truth, but they don't really have the whole truth. Now, all of these things fall into the God is out there in the realm of things that you don't know. When this is presented, it's either a little bit dishonest, although I'm not, when I say dishonest, I don't mean somebody's intentionally lying or trying to deceive, because they're equivocating between the God that they believe in and the God that we might say, this God might exist in the unknown. So in a way, they're kind of admitting that the God they believe in should either be included in that category of things that we don't know about, in which completely undermines their position that they know it, or they're equating their God with something in that category and claiming that they have special knowledge of this. And that may be the case, but if you have special knowledge and you expect anybody else to be justified who doesn't have that special knowledge, it is on you to demonstrate that you do in fact have that knowledge, how you have it, and how they can have it as well. And I guess I don't want to talk forever about this, because I want to make sure we get to all the questions people have for about as long as we can stand. But that's a lot of the reasons, not all, but that's a lot of the reasons that I'm an atheist. I found that there were things that I believed that didn't have good reason. And when I went looking for good reasons, not only did I not find them, but I found that the questions themselves were flawed, that the proposals being offered not only had not met a burden of proof, but potentially could never meet that burden of proof. Now, I'm absolutely happy to be shown that I'm wrong about that. Unfortunately, the attempts to do so keep coming up with problems and fallacies. And it's one of the reasons why I enjoy doing discussions and debates, in part because, of course, I think I'm correct. Of course, I would like to change people's mind. But in addition to me thinking that I'm correct, I also recognize that I might, in fact, be wrong. Not all atheists are atheists for the same reasons or for good reasons. Not all Christians are the Christians for the same reasons or for good reasons. I'm not saying that nobody has a good reason. I'm saying I have yet to be presented with anything I can identify as a good reason. And the fact that we've been having these discussions and debates for seemingly as long as we've been able to discuss and debate things, I think weighs heavily on the claim that there is or could be a God.
Well, thank you, Matt, for that. This is the interactive portion of the program. If you would like to ask a question or converse with Matt and ask questions about things that he's perhaps mentioned, or even stuff that he said in the past, you're welcome to click the raise hand button, which will then indicate to me that you wish to be made live with Matt as a co-panelist, and then I will allow you to go back and forth with Matt and dialogue with him about his atheism. We have one hand raised so far. Let me bring up Curtis. Hey, Curtis.
Hello. Hey, how are you?
Good. You're live with Matt Dillahunty.
Awesome. Nice to meet you, Matt.
Nice to meet you too.
Great discussion. Good to hear some of your views. I've been following you along for a little while now. Mm-hmm. So one question. The central principle for most theological positions seems to sort of circulate around the idea of consciousness. Mm-hmm. And I think that's sort of probably the key aspect when it comes to these underlying religious and just culturally traditional views. Sorry, I have a little bit of noise in the background, kids running around, so
I can hear you.
What are your views on consciousness in light of, and you may not be familiar with like the quantum mechanical investigations when it comes to that, yeah. But there are some significant findings with respect to consciousness in that side. And then on the philosophical side, where it comes to the hard problem of consciousness. So you can sort of tackle it on both ends. I'd be interested to hear what your thoughts are in light of that.
So I think I'd start by saying I recognize that there's certainly a problem with this idea of consciousness, this idea of self-awareness being an active thinking agent with, reflection and the ability to make decisions based on information, and the appearance or illusion in some people's point of view that we could have perhaps done something different, where we get into notions of free will. But consciousness itself, setting aside the issues of free will, let's pretend for a second that we have no explanation for consciousness, which may in fact be the case. We are not justified in assuming that because we don't currently have an explanation that this warrants us leaping to the supernatural as an explanation. The mere fact that we haven't found a natural explanation doesn't mean that there is a supernatural one or that there could be. And as long as we're stuck and we can't actually investigate the supernatural, then we are stuck in this position of looking for naturalistic explanations. For me, I am largely in agreement with Dan Dennett. His book, Consciousness Explained, which, by the way, I always love to point out that one of the more popular reviews of his book was Consciousness Explained Away. They said that the book should have been titled Consciousness Explained Away. I have viewed consciousness as an emergent property. You know, like there's nothing in water molecules that would be wet, but if you get enough of them together, you get this property that is wetness. That's a very rough analogy, and I'm not going to say it comes close to comparing with what happens with consciousness. But even, you know, when I was saying even absent an explanation for consciousness, consciousness is evident. We you know, I can tell when somebody's conscious or unconscious. We can test for that. And I think that I can see why this has such impact on people. As a matter of fact, I did a debate about the existence of a soul. And this is where consciousness comes in most often, is in discussions about a soul. And there was a lot of discussion about the brain. You know, if we alter a brain, I lose my memory, I lose my, you know, preferences, I can change my personality. What happened there? You know, is my soul separate? And so there's still this dualism idea of, hey, there's a soul, the ghost in the machine, and hey, there's the consciousness, that are potentially separate. I said before that if I'm standing here talking to you and you fall down and die, it's very clear that there was something about you that is no longer there. That you are no longer responding to me, you are no longer breathing, you know, there's no eye movement, there's no sound, there's nothing. And this is where we get the idea that there's a shell that something has left. But does my liver have a consciousness? Because my liver also dies and could die. You know, I could lose a liver and still be alive. There's something about the liver, you know, it's currently functioning and it can die. Does it then have what we would call consciousness? And I don't see any great distinction between recognizing the difference between a living thing and a dead thing that requires us to posit a magical substance that leaves, as much as a function that has ceased. And so I view consciousness largely as a function of the brain, an emergent property. The mind is an emergent property of the brain. As with all my positions, that's where I am tentatively based on what I understand. But I don't know how one would prove that there's something more. I'm not saying that there's not. I'm saying that if there was, I don't know how you would prove it. When I shut my phone off or pull the battery out, did it lose anything that could be called consciousness? I think there's a good argument that what we're calling consciousness, what we're identifying, is virtually indistinguishable from shutting my phone off. The difference, of course, being that it's much easier to turn their phone back on and replace a battery than it is currently to replace a brain. But I think the thought experiments that have been done here, which I love, which drives some other people crazy because we're talking about, you know, matters of identity. If I was able to pull out your brain and put another brain in, are you dead? Would this other brain carry with it whatever consciousness it had, you know, or is there something about you as an entity that would then imbue itself into that consciousness? I think given what we know about science, that the former is more likely than the latter. But it may be the case that we'll never know, because the brain might just be the sort of thing that we're always going to be limited in how much we can investigate it. I hope not. I hope we eventually learn everything about it. I'd love to find out exactly what's happening that we're labeling as consciousness, but I don't think we know.
Sure. One of the two convincing principles I want to say with regards to the investigation of consciousness that made it a little bit more compelling for me, that consciousness is distinct perhaps from physicality or function. Two of those things were in the nature of intentionality and qualia, so like the subjective look and feel of things.
Yeah, I'm with Dennett in rejecting qualia pretty much across the board.
Oh, okay. I mean, I'm sort of I'm an idealist, so I kind of fit into the category whereby that which we perceive as matter is just qualia. So I kind of take the simulation perspective. But with regards to intentionality, and I think this is probably sort of the key point in me sort of accepting consciousness as a fundamental principle, one of many, is that when we look at the world around us and we look at, let's say, matter and objects and various things as such, there's nothing inherent to like the color green per se, like the green of a light, like a stoplight, or the red of a stop sign, that says that informs us that we should stop, you know what I mean, or that we should go. It seems like meaning is representational, and matter is not inherently representational. So it seems like if matter was identical to properties of mind, then representation would be intrinsic to the identity of how things are configured. But it doesn't seem that. It seems like they run parallel to that, you know what I mean? So there's sort of a correlation, but there's not a necessary correlation. So in some alternate state, perhaps some alternate country, green could mean go, could mean stop, sorry, and then red could mean go.
Yeah, those are entire. So the idea to stop or go is entirely a construct, as, by the way, is the label of red and green.
Right.
Like this is a green. Those are labels we put on it. But the fact that there is something that we can physically assess, that we know the wavelengths different between red and green, so there is a physical difference that allows us to distinguish between the two. That's separate from the meaning that we imbue upon them, or the social constructs around it.
Sure. Yeah, I think the key thing in understanding that for me was understanding that the configuration of the matter still didn't necessitate meaning at all. So there could be no meaning applied, projected onto those things.
Right. So my position is there's no intrinsic. Those types of constructs just don't exist absent minds. That's something that we do.
Correct. So even when it comes to functions, like we imbue representational meaning onto functions of things. So and how we correlate that to matter is something distinct there. So it made me kind of step back and say, okay, there's this category of meaning, right, that we experience in the world that may not necessarily be tied into a particular physical object. It could be absent from that at all. We project it onto there. But if we are identical to our brains, it would seem that we would have to be intrinsically, our brain would have to be identical to the property of projecting meaning, versus having something that can say, aha, there's sort of that subjective, raw, empirical quality, and then there's meaning, and then mind is what overlaps them in sort of some type of simultaneous sort of, I want to say like tracing paper type thing,
I'm not even disagreeing with you. I'm just saying that whatever it is that the brain is doing. So we have, I agree with you, but I don't see how that shows in any way that the brain is incapable of producing concepts. As a matter of fact, that seems so antithetical to what I would understand as the brain's function. So when we talk about what the brain does as a function, first of all, I don't say I'm necessarily identical to my brain. Identity is a temporal limited thing. So if there are people, for example, who've suffered brain injuries whose personality completely changes, I think you could make a good case that they are in fact no longer the same person. And so there's kind of two me's. There's the experiential me that relies on continuity. When I go to sleep at night and I don't remember anything. I don't even know how often I dream or anything else.
Like an ego self, yeah.
I'm not aware of what's going on. I wake up in the morning. Is it possible that last night I was, actually abducted by aliens and replaced with an exact duplicate, and that now I am not the same actual package of things that I think I am? Sure. Similarly, I think I'm not the same person I was 10 years ago. In some regards, if you took these two distinct points in time and looked at them, there would be great differences about who I am, both from my own identity and from the identity that people are putting on me. The difference there is that we assume that we would be able to verify a continuity even absent my own conscious awareness. So for example, I could sleep all night and I could have somebody stand guard who's conscious and awake, and provided I'm willing to trust them, they would verify the continuity of this particular sack of meat and everything else. But even if we got to the point where we said, you know, our brains can do this thing of processing the world and implying meaning and communicating those ideas to others so that we have some shared understanding of the world. Even if that were a complete mystery, well, if it were a complete mystery, we'd have no justification for any explanation. But the fact that it might be mysterious doesn't in any way lend itself to me leaping to a supernatural explanation, because first of all, there has to be some explanation. And the explanation could just be, we're wrong in how we're viewing this, that we don't have the language or understanding to be able to actually accurately model what it is we're talking about. So that's one possibility. And I think that us being wrong is quite likely. Then there is a completely natural explanation, which we don't have yet. And then the third might be that there is a non-natural explanation. And when I look at those as to which one I think is more likely, I can't tell you the likelihood of a supernatural explanation because I have zero data to assess a probability for that. But I can say we are wrong quite a lot, and we discover things that we didn't before suspect. And so those two, while I can't assign a probability to this, so there's always going to be a math error here, those two feel more likely, but at a minimum, these are two explanations that I have access to potentially, and I still don't have access to this one potentially yet. I'll avoid singling it out because that would be rude. Yeah, I don't have any explanation for consciousness. I have, a handful of thoughts about it.
No problem. I appreciate your thoughts for sure. I just have one last question, and then I shall jump off. But definitely nice to meet you. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I would
Thank you.
Love to dialogue a little bit more in the future, perhaps. So I don't really subscribe to this natural supernatural dichotomy. I mean, I think in the same way that if consciousness has the properties that it has and it's not reducible to physicality or matter, but we experience it firsthand, and we in some sense can't deny it because it's the faculty through which we know everything else in the world, including the empirical world that is distinct from us, then I don't really have a problem with calling it natural. I just call it natural. It's just something that's not reducible to something else.
Yeah.
But you seem to have this sort of natural supernatural dichotomy, and I don't know if it's just a response to the typical religious tradition that just floats it around, or if you actually think it's a legitimate thing to kind of hold. But let's just say that there is no dichotomy there and everything's natural. Mm-hmm. How would you define natural? And then how would you demarcate some of the things that might be coherent, but perhaps not actual, like telepathy, like, we can make technology that can kind of transmit information from our brains,
right?
Perhaps there's some creature in another part of the universe that has this built-in organic nature capacity to, in the same way that sonar works, kind of transmit this data. If there are some bizarre things, perhaps in quantum biology or something along those lines that takes advantage of some subtle, how would you demarcate that as natural or non-natural or supernatural even?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would. So one of the things is the things that we tend to label supernatural. What if we found out that what we're really talking about is something natural? And it may be the case, and it's been argued before, that the things that we once labeled supernatural, as soon as we find them and understand them, they essentially become part of the natural world. Hey, gravity is a weird thing that was beyond people's comprehension. And when we understand it, it is included in the natural world. And so I think if there's it may be better to do the demarcation between things that real things that exist in reality, are identifiable in reality, that we have some decent understanding for, and things that are outside of our understanding. Things that when we might talk about something like, I'm going to avoid getting too deep into epistemic possibility and metaphysical possibility for now, because it may come up later. But if we say this is possible or not impossible based on what we know. So I don't know that I would draw a demarcation. I think I agree with you that most of what I talk about with regard to the supernatural is probably a response to assertions from religions and superstitions and other things that the explanation is in fact supernatural. So when they talk about, for example, let's say that there was a soul, but it was something natural that we just didn't have some stringy, quirky, put in whatever mysticalized science terminology you want, ultimately becomes the explanation. I'm fine with that. And even if it turned out it was supernatural, if it was something beyond the natural world, even if we got into this idea of there's a God who exists outside of space and time, outside of reality, I think this is where we get to the core of what a lot of people want to label as supernatural. If we found that there was another realm, maybe it's a multiverse thing. Maybe there's just another realm that we didn't have access to. The big point for me is the time to believe that something is true is after it's actually been demonstrated. We shouldn't believe it just because it hasn't been debunked. We shouldn't believe it just because we don't have a better explanation. By the way, not a fan of string theory. I'm not a fan of it being called theory because I don't think it's actually risen to that. I'm not sure, and I have a limited understanding, so I will go back and forth. I've had arguments with Lawrence Krauss and others, and that's just me. I'm happy to have arguments about things because I'm trying to understand them. When he talks about a universe from nothing and stuff like that, but there are aspects of some models of string theory that I don't see should be labeled as a theory. I think it's scientists being a little exuberant, maybe hyperbolic about their confidence in things. But there's no denying that quantum mechanics and other disciplines do actually make predictions, which makes them at least potentially useful sciences. We might find out that we're wrong, just as we found out we were wrong about Newtonian physics. I mean, it is correct within this very limited scope, and outside of that, it's not. And this is all about us gaining a better understanding. So it might be better to say that the traditional claims of religion that appeal to what has normally been called supernatural are either A, not real, or B, not identifiably real, not a part of our actual understanding yet. And both of those pose a problem for religion, because in the first case, the people who believe them are wrong. And in the second case, the people who believe them are demonstrably irrational. They are believing something before there's good reason to. And as soon as they can provide the good reason, I'll accept it. And I would imagine, maybe become a part of science. You get a Nobel Prize for proving the existence of a soul or something along those lines. But I guess that's the best I can do on that.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I look forward to chatting again in the future at some point in time. Love to chop it up. Sure. And I shall step back. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Curtis. Okay, so we have two hands raised currently. Let me bring up Blake.
While you're getting to them, I think I'll point out that it's fun because I love so many subjects. I'm an expert in nothing. I'm barely an expert in my opinion. And I think it's great that there are, these heavy subjects of consciousness and, string theory and how do we go about labeling things. These are, I love these discussions. Absolutely nothing I say is anything that I expect anybody should take just because I said so. I could be wrong. You need to go out and do your own investigation. I don't know.
Yeah. All right. Well, we have Blake. Greetings, Blake.
Hey, wow. I'm actually really surprised I'm up first. I waited a long
time. I don't want to talk to this guy.
That troublemaker.
Hey, are you like finished with this year? It's cool?
Yeah. So I've got another 3 months before
Did you do well? Have you brought your report card?
I'm hiding it. No, I did. It was good. It was a good year.
Of course it was.
Yes.
For those who don't know, Blake and I have done 2 debates, and we're getting ready to do a 3rd debate back at the Bible and Beer Consortium, which is still a point of weirdness for me. But
Hey, as long as there's beer involved. But hey, man, Matt, thanks for obviously coming out and doing this with us. That's really cool of you, and it's always a joy to listen to you. I think everybody can pick up on sort of the honesty that you bring to the table, and it just makes a lot of people want to, kind of pick your brain, and I know I'm one of them.
Don't pick it apart. I want to be able to.
Nah, just understand it. I think you and I are on the same page in terms of wanting to really understand each other and where we're coming from. I think a lot about your views, especially because we're preparing for another debate. I've tried to step into your worldview a lot and really understand it, and we've kind of teased out a little bit of it in person, or even over Skype. And I think what it ultimately all comes down to is this idea of the method that we use. So you're always talking about how, well, theists come back and say, on my model, we can't confirm the supernatural. And then you come back and say, well, yeah, but that's because we don't have a method that can confirm the supernatural.
Yeah.
And so I think that's ultimately what it all boils down to, is this idea of a method. And when we were on Dogma Debate, I raised sort of a budding worry about it even being circular beyond what you were objecting to. So some theists say it's circular, you come back with a response, and then there's another step in. And so I want to throw it at you and just get your feedback on it, because it's currently my thought process in terms of stepping into your worldview and thinking, oh, what might be wrong with this? So so you say that science is the best way of knowing not necessarily all the truths out there, but science is good at getting us some truths that we can be confident in, and that's maybe not certain, but that we can be more confident in.
So
is that right?
Okay. So I'm only clarifying this. I know you already get it. Science doesn't make pronouncements about truth at all. Science doesn't say this is true. Science builds models and theories that are the best current explanations given the available information, and they are always subject to revision, so there's no pronouncement about truth, and I know you get that. But when you say science is the best way, what I would say is, currently, I am aware of no more consistently reliable pathway to an accurate and useful predictive understanding of reality than what we have in these sciences, because I don't want to portray science as one thing.
Right. And before you said, hey, for all I know, there are occurrences of the supernatural. When I talk about science bringing us accuracies, I'm not saying that it's comprehensive and getting us all knowledge. What I'm saying is that it gets us accuracies, and we can know that they're accuracies, or at least we have a good reason to believe in them. So I just wanted to make sure we're on the same page there. And so when trying to figure out what the best method is for learning about reality, ultimately, we're saying that the best method is the one that is able to get us facts reliably. Is that right? Get us accuracies.
Yeah, I think it'd be fair to say that. I mean, I think there's a little bit more to it. There's the predictive nature of it, but that all gets to determining accuracy. I think my primary objection isn't so much advocating for scientism, although I would. Depending on, scientism gets a bad rap, and understandably, for the same reason I don't say I'm a philosophical naturalist, I'm a methodological one. I don't tend to say I'm an advocate of scientism, because there's some baggage along with that. But my view is, let's say you came up with some new way of knowing, some other process other than science. How would you demonstrate the efficacy of that process without relying on something like science, or it's like, if I come up with a new way to measure and I've got a yardstick and it's only divided into inches, and then I have a ruler and I can show, okay, this is subdivided further, which gets me a further refinement. It's still just as accurate as this one, but it's refined further, and you can keep going. So you're basically building off of what you already understand. And so I'm not aware of a way that we could come up with a new way of knowing, for lack of a better label, that doesn't at least begin by demonstrating its minimal efficacy as equivalent or comparable to that of what we have currently. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. And so I did want to comment real quick, when you talk about like the utility of predictive power, even there, it's it's a successful prediction because it churns out an accuracy. Oh, look, it fits an accuracy over there. So that's the value of the predictiveness. So we're confirming the method's reliability by checking to see that it gets us real accuracies. And in this case, if we're saying that the best method is the one that gets us sort of these known accuracies, I want to ask, how do we know what the known accuracies are? Because the next possible circle would be that the so-called known accuracies that we're confirming, the only way we're going to call them known accuracies is if, in fact, they fit the original method. So you're going to say a miracle, for instance, couldn't be a known accuracy. And so even if miracles were occurring all the time, it would never enter into the method, because it would never be allowed as an accuracy, and so it would never be our best way to know things. That's the circle I'm worried about. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So how do we know that the method is accurate, and you're concerned about the circularity of that? Well, for one thing, if it wasn't, everything that we know about the universe would have to be wrong. So we're relying on what we know about the universe. It's like saying, how do I know that this ruler is accurately measuring inches? Well, it's because we can compare it to the standard, but the standard is arbitrary. If we went to something that wasn't arbitrary, like the number of atoms in a mole, that's measurable, and the confirmation isn't circular with the method. It is a confirmation of an observation. It is quantifiable, essentially. And this is where we get into a big problem, because there may be things that aren't quantifiable, and those are incredibly difficult to know that we have a good understanding of, which is why science doesn't do that so much as say that this is our best understanding of this. My concern is that, so if miracles are happening all the time, first of all, we have to define what we mean by miracle. And then when we talk about how would we go about confirming a miracle? Now, you wouldn't probably do this. As a matter of fact, you might not buy into much of any of this. I don't know for sure because we haven't talked about it. But when somebody says that they've witnessed a miracle, and I don't mean a bus crashed and 2 people survived and they call that a miracle, because that to me is garbage. And you're basically saying, why not say that the miracle is that the 93 other people in the bus died? I mean, now you're just being arbitrary about it. So if we're going to try and verify that a miracle happened, that's separate from what caused the miracle. And one of the problems with this is that normally when people talk about miracles, they're not just talking about the event, they are also talking about the cause. They'll say, my aunt had cancer, and we prayed, and she was completely cancer-free. And so there is the incident of verifying that cancer existed and then cancer didn't exist. And the cause for that is completely separate. How do we tie prayer to that, for example? And even if we could tie prayer to it consistently, how does that tie to the truth of what they're praying to? I don't know of any method to do that. So I don't say miracles don't occur. I'm saying I don't know of any examples or any method by which we can verify that a miracle occurred. And when we investigate the claims of these extraordinary events, sometimes we find that they're not extraordinary at all. There's a statue down here that weeps blood, and we go and investigate it, and it turns out it's not it's not blood, or it's an intentional con, or it's some natural phenomena. I don't know, and that's why I'm stuck. Somebody in chat just asked if the placebo effect is a miracle. Now I think we're talking about what the brain can't do.
Yeah, let's go on.
But I don't know how to verify it. And as soon as somebody shows how they can verify it, I'm on board. And one of the things, and I'll stop after this, when somebody comes in and tells me, like there was a guy who called the show to say he'd been abducted by aliens his entire life, I don't tell him that what he experienced didn't happen. I can't do that. I'm happy to believe that he is accurately relaying what he thinks happened to him, but I don't for a second think that he was actually being abducted by aliens. I don't know what, maybe he's got some sort of brain issue, there's delusional, there's a number of possibilities, and one of those possibilities is that he was actually abducted by aliens over and over. I am willing to believe that he's accurately conveying the information as he has it, but I don't believe that it's accurate, and I don't know how to verify whether it's accurate, and the same is a problem for miracles.
Okay, one super quick question, then I'll follow up with the question I was planning on asking. Do you think that he's rational at that point for believing that aliens abducted him?
Well, I don't know. I don't know that I have enough information to determine whether or not he's rational. I don't necessarily believe, I can't conclude that he is necessarily irrational.
You're right. That's not, we don't have enough information for that. You're right.
But I may have been able to talk to him enough to where I could conclude that I think he's irrational. Fair
enough. Okay. And so I'm trying to remember, because I know I asked this before, but I don't remember your answer. So imagine that all the eschatological events that are described in the book of Revelation, take it all, literally or whatnot. I mean, it's just one after another. In fact, we've had, just as they've been predicting, just on like the Left Behind series, that book is almost tailor-made to what's happening one after again and again and again. So it's following through. And you're here witnessing everything. Do you have what it takes in order to conclude that something that God is there after all, or what would you do after a certain period of time?
I apologize.
No, you're good.
My wife has come with fresh water. Thank you, sir.
Oh, hey.
They said hi. All right. So one more time at the end of it. I just missed the last couple seconds.
Yeah. So these eschatological events, as depicted by the Left Behind series, start occurring, and after you're here for all of it. You're seeing it one after another.
This is a hypothetical, right? You're not saying they actually are occurring.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
That was the part I missed.
We're imagining a scenario where you're actually undergoing this, these experiences, and you're seeing all this occurring, and everybody else, as far as you can tell, is seeing it as well. Can you reach a point where you conclude, okay, that there's something supernatural?
No, but I can reach a point that here's a better example that is roughly analogous. Going back to the James Randi Educational Foundation, there are people who make claims of the paranormal. Nobody has ever been able to produce the phenomenon that they claim they can produce, whether it's dowsing or remote viewing or any of the number of things. They fail, and we'll set aside the reasons. But let's say somebody succeeded. Let's say that they grabbed their dowsing rod and they went out and successfully found all the things. So now we have hard confirmed data that they can in fact do what they claim they can do. I think I can compare this fairly to, let's say that there were clear and explicit events in the book of Revelation, which is already not true. This is subject to interpretation, but let's say we had this list of things. Here are the things that are in this ancient book, and they're going to happen in this order, and it's going to culminate in a disaster. If we had confirmation that these things were in fact happening and happening in this order, then I think it would be entirely reasonable to conclude that this passage has demonstrated that it has accurately modeled what's going to happen, and that there's some non-zero or perhaps even significant likelihood that the final event is likely to occur. That's, of course, an inference. It could be that it got all of them right except for the last one. I don't know, but at least we would have something. But being able to verify a correct prediction or even a correct series of prediction doesn't in and of itself tell you how that prediction was made. Was it made because they were able to see the future, or did somebody else relay the information about the future to them? How does this happen? Does it happen because something exists outside of time, or do we have a TARDIS, a Time Lord that we can, or is there some alien species that has been able to build a supercomputer that models reality such that it absolutely knows that everything's going to happen? Is the world that deterministic? So we don't know what the conclusion is. And at the end of the day, I don't know that it would matter in assessing the situation, because when I look at it, I say, okay, this person has made 8 accurate predictions in a row. I now think that there's a decent chance that their 9th prediction could be accurate as well. Darren Brown, by the way, did a special called The System, and it uses an old con to play upon this natural instinct of ours. Essentially, you pick a bunch of people and you send out 50% get this prediction, 50% get the other prediction. And then from the ones that were correct, you divide that in half and you give them 2 different predictions. And you keep doing that until you have somebody who has, purely by happenstance, been the recipient of 6 or 7 correct predictions in a row. And now all of a sudden they're willing to bet their life savings on the next one. And in fact, they have been conned. There is something about this that they don't know. And we know that it is, in this case, a con, that there were all these people and they were the one that got. That's going to happen. As a matter of fact, in September, I plan to have everybody in the audience take a coin and flip it. And if you get tails, you sit down and you see how long you can go, because you can get, in a large enough audience of maybe 400 people, you might get somebody who gets 9, 10, 11, 12 heads in a row. And that would seem miraculous if that was the only information that they had, when in fact it's not miraculous. Now, if we're looking at something like the Revelation example, it may be that we don't have enough information. I still don't know how we could get to say this is the reason why it's correct, but I think we would be rational in saying, based on the information I have, this has been correct repeatedly. This is very likely to be correct. Not necessarily bet your life on it correct, but having a high confidence.
And it wouldn't suggest to you at all that there's something supernatural?
No, I'm not saying that. Would I wonder if perhaps there was a supernatural explanation? Sure. Would it suggest to me that the supernatural has become a plausible explanation? No. Because until I can say this is a plausible explanation, I have to have some demonstration that it's even real. Because the supernatural, by the way, ends up being a broad term here. Is time travel, does that count as supernatural?
Here's my understanding of supernatural is an effect that's produced or an event that is not produced by natural entities. In employing their natural power. So there are different accounts of what the laws of nature are. So I'm a substances, powers, liabilities person. I think that you have objects and they have what philosophers call powers. They're things they just do, like electrons just do certain things. They just can. And so a miraculous event is an event that's produced that's beyond the powers of the natural entities operating at the time.
Yeah, I think that would require absolute knowledge to conclude that there's something that's not produced naturally. On the flip side, though, as soon as you had a mechanism by which you could demonstrate that something was caused by something not natural, now you don't need absolute knowledge. So you could say, okay, here's what an electron can do. And I think it would require perfect absolute knowledge to say that this happened and it cannot be caused by an electron, because that's not within the realm of things electrons can do. Or you'd at least have to have absolute knowledge about what electrons can do, which we don't necessarily have. But if you had instead confirmation that this was not from electrons, that this was, I don't know what the mechanism would be because we're not there. Then you wouldn't need absolute knowledge about electrons. All you would then have knowledge that this is not included in electrons, even if you don't know what everything is included in electrons. Does that make sense?
I think so. I think I get the gist. Very cool, man. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to let other people get their questions in. Looking forward to talking in August.
Yeah, I'm looking forward. It'll be the first debate that I've done on the resurrection, and I'm so happy to be moving beyond the generic God claims, especially, and no offense to you, but you already know how I feel about it when I debate, Jesus-loving theists who only present abstract notions for a deistic God. It just drives me crazy.
Yeah, I know how you feel, because I want to talk about Jesus' resurrection as well in those debates. I know for a lot of us, at least, the sentiment is it's such a big topic.
The thing is, go ahead.
Well, it's such a big topic that trying to justify both God's existence and Jesus's resurrection, which you need to do, it's just nearly impossible to present a case that would be remotely persuasive that quickly. So most just try to take it bite-sized chunks. So
I will say this, and I know that you'll take this as it's intended, but since this is a specific group about apologetics, the more often this happens, the more the secular community starts to develop perceptions about debaters. And so I will caution every Christian apologist in particular who's going into a debate, if you come in and debate the existence of a God and keep it generic, a deistic, the cosmological argument, etc., that's fine. But if in your closing remarks you start to go on and on about Jesus and all these other things that you haven't talked about in the debate, the secular community tends to look at that as, wow, look how dishonest these folks are. They're just trying to smuggle a Jesus message in. Doesn't mean that's the case, but that is how it's perceived. And there's a lot of talk of people that's like, why don't they defend this to begin with? Part of that,
or at least probably the apologist. I don't think I did this, but I would have if I thought about it. Just saying, because I think it's obvious. Obviously, just because God exists, that doesn't mean that Jesus resurrected from the dead or that Christianity is true. But I think if in the Christian mindset, there's a bunch of people listening. In our mind, it's true. Christianity is true, and so it makes sense to present the gospel quickly, like Jesus did this too, and invite them to think about it. But
it's a terrible position to be in, and I understand it, having been there before, where let's say I was still a believer, you and I feel an obligation to share the gospel message under any circumstances, and it's hard to pass up. You've got 400 people here, you've got a bunch of atheists, and I have to at least share the gospel with them, because that's the Great Commission. There's no Great Commission to demonstrate the cosmological argument. It's just tell them about Jesus. Get into a debate like that, I understand the necessity. You did it just a little bit in one, but John did it much more in another, and the comments on YouTube were just...
Oh, man, okay.
But I ignore YouTube comments anyway, because it's a cesspool of garbage, even on my own videos. So I'm pretty much done with YouTube comments.
Cool, man. Well, thanks again. It was good chatting.
Sure, thanks.
Thank you, Blake. Okay, let's bring up... currently have 4 hands raised. Jason's been having...
I will try to be more succinct so that people don't have to wait as long.
Hey, Jason.
Oh! Hey, Matt. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm pretty good, man. You and I have actually talked before on via email and in your Path of Exile stream. First thing I wanted to say was thanks to Apologetics Academy. That's pretty cool, having you on here.
I'm loving it.
And the other thing I wanted to say, I kind of wanted to pick your brain on it a little bit, Matt. It seems to me, as a former theist, and I was an atheist in a foxhole for over 23 years. I was a former theist, fundamental Baptist. It seems to me that there is actually like this overarching lack of humility in the theist position. I'm not trying to insult anybody, but what I'm getting at is basically that you would have to believe at your core that the creator of this 13.5 billion light-year wide universe and over 24.5 million different species of animals, we're basically floating, on a piece of sand on a big beach in a universe of beaches, right? So I've wondered what you thought maybe about using that to actually point out to theists that when they come to you and they act as if they're being humble, that their position really isn't one that of humility at all. It's really, basically the creator of everything is my best friend.
Yeah, I've talked about this before in a couple different ways. Of course, if there's something monumentally arrogant in assuming that the entirety of the universe was created with you as the special purpose, this is true right down to, Jews being the chosen people of God. Even out of all the people on earth, the Jews were the chosen one. You can, and I have pointed out how arrogant this is. On the other hand, having been a Christian for a number of years, I also understand it from that perspective as well. I didn't think so much that God did all this specifically for me because I was special. God did all this specifically for me because God was special.
Right.
So you could make an argument that this is a false humility, but I tend to view it more as understanding. I want to make sure that if I'm addressing somebody and their views, I address it as honestly and accurately as possible. So I can talk to them and say, wow, it certainly seems like it might be incredibly arrogant to assume that the entirety of the universe was created for you, or even for us. Because quite frankly, when we do it as a for us, then that takes away some of, it's not so much that I'm special, but humans in general are special. We have that view all the time anyway. When you talk about, when you start arguing about evolution and things like that and consciousness, humans are the ones that are, the absolute pinnacle and best. Well, yes, under human criteria of what we value as best, we're the best.
Yeah.
We're not the best runners, et cetera. There's also a counter to this within the various theologies, that not only is it not that we're so special, it's God special, we should just be happy. There's the opposite of that we're not only not special, we are, reprobate degenerates who are deserving of, torment and torture. And God in his infinite mercy has decided to spare at least some people from that.
Yeah, right.
One of the things I try to do if I'm going to actually have a conversation with people is, the whole tell me what you believe and why. I keep cautioning atheists, because when we start talking about arrogance and condescension, the atheist community has got its fair share of that too, and I've been guilty of it on many, many occasions. You can't do a show for 11 years and not come off as arrogant and condescending. You can't pretend like this group of people who don't believe what the vast majority of people believe have somehow got the right answer isn't arrogant. We could be completely right, but it doesn't mean that it's not necessarily arrogant to do so. So I've kind of changed some tactics over the years. I'm happy to call BS wherever there's clear BS. But the one thing I've made sure that I stop doing is asserting what someone's motivations are as if I could read their mind. This popped up just yesterday on a new YouTube video I posted where somebody commented about Josephus, and I pointed out that the Testimonium Flavius is most likely, I'm convinced, an interpolation. And somebody came on and said, oh, I hate it when atheists call it an interpolation. It's a fallacy. It's an obvious fallacy, and it was done by these people for this reason. That just makes atheists look completely unreasonable. It's one thing to say, based on the evidence, I'm convinced that this particular passage was inserted at a later time, possibly and probably by these individuals for this reason. And here's my evidence for it. It wasn't, cited by Origen, even though he was, familiar with this. So if he would have cited it if it was there, so clearly it came in later. And there's a whole bunch of arguments that you can make. But as soon as you say that this is a fiction invented by these people for this reason, you have not only adopted a burden of proof that you probably can't meet, but you've shifted the burden of proof, because if in fact it is accurate and reasonable, it is on them to demonstrate this.
Right.
And the error in shifting the burden of proof is this: I'm a believer. Of course, I'm convinced I'm right. I already have this perception that you have to prove to me that I'm wrong before I'm going to change my mind. If in fact you try to prove that I'm wrong by adopting an unmeetable burden of proof and you fail, I become more convinced that I'm right, because I've now had an occurrence where somebody tried to prove that I'm wrong and they failed. And that, even though it shouldn't be evidence for my position, does end up weighting it. And that's why I try to be very careful about how things are phrased. I'm going to screw up over and over again.
We all do.
My big thing is to say, instead of so much asserting that what you believe is wrong, I want to get to whether or not you should believe for the reasons you give. So it's not so much when we say, oh, well, did Jesus actually exist? I don't know. I'm fine either way. I'm fine with the idea that there was a real historical person, and I'm fine with the idea that there wasn't.
Right.
What I want to address is why people believe it, and then point out why I don't, in the hopes that this shows them that their reasons for believing are false, even if what they believe might be true. Because accepting that possibility, for example, I roll a die 6 times with my lucky socks on, and I get 6 6s. Oh my gosh, my socks are lucky. Hang on a minute. Let's talk about why you think your socks actually had something to do with that roll. instead of talking about whether or not you actually rolled 6 sixes, which you in fact did, let's talk about what your justification is for the reason. So I'm really pushing a lot less pretended mind reading, a lot less hyperbole. And I think the only time I would really point out that a particular position is arrogant is if the individual expressing it was clearly also being arrogant.
Well, that's the case that I've tended to use it in the past. It's not like I just come out and say, hey, you're arrogant, because I have the experiential position of actually being there. And I happen to know that, like, the majority of Christians are usually just, fun-loving guys and gals like everybody else, But every once in a while you get somebody who's, all hellfire and brimstone. When I was a theist, I was pretty hellfire and brimstone. It's part and parcel of being a fundamental Baptist.
I try to make sure I don't pick out the worst examples either. Like, I mean, there are occasions where I will point out Westboro Baptist Church, but they don't really represent the bulk of Christianity.
Right.
There are occasions where I might pick out that Pastor John Anderson dude or whoever. But depending on how you're using it, that could be a completely, dishonest thing. I've seen people come up produce videos against SJW, feminism, whatever else, and then they go out and get the worst arguments. And I've seen the thing work in reverse too. So I think our community, the atheist community, is struggling with a lack of nuance in a lot of the discussions. And it's understandable because a lot of atheists who come from theistic backgrounds are furious that they were, from their new perspective, they were duped and deluded. And it's really easy to leap to, oh, this was intentional. This is for control. It's the opiate of the masses. There's, this desire to control people. And I think it's a mistake to, even if it were true, to go down that road if you can't demonstrate.
Okay. Well, hey, Matt, there's just one more thing I wanted to run by you, and I'll let you get to the theists, because when you get an opportunity to do that, right? There's been a lot of atheist call-ins lately. Anyways, what I wanted to ask is, this happens a lot where you run into people and they go into the, I'm trying to think about how to phrase the argument, but basically you've elaborated several times, more times than I can count with the digits on my body here, that when you assert that you think something hasn't met its burden of proof, that you're not saying that it does not exist. Right. And I'm wondering if you have any tools or methodologies or like some examples that you can use regularly to demonstrate, even like a logical example or something, that makes it very simplistic, something that the theist can understand, very simply.
Well, if you're sitting as a judge and the defendant's accused of murdering someone, you might even be personally convinced from their demeanor that they're guilty. But if the prosecution hasn't presented evidence that under the law would be sufficient to convict them, you would have to return a not guilty verdict. Right. And so you're not necessarily saying this person didn't do it. What you're saying is, I don't yet have sufficient evidence to do that.
Okay. Yeah, I've heard you use the judge one several times. But hey, thank you very much, Matt, for your time.
Thanks,
thanks again to the Apologetics Academy. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
All right.
Thank you, Jason. Okay. Okay. Devin's left us, so we only have 2 hands currently. Let me bring up Josh, who is a philosophy student at Oxford. For some reason, it's not promoting. Here we are. It's just disappeared. Then bring up Salvador.
You're in the UK, aren't you?
I am. Yeah, I'm currently in Newcastle in the northeast of England.
I'm hoping to. I was there. I was in Manchester last year. I'm hoping to make a trip back and hit London and a couple other places, in part because I was fortunate to meet and develop a rapport with Anthony Grayling, and I'm desperate to go over to his College of the Humanities and explore it and perhaps talk to some of the folks there. So.
Great. Well, Salvador is on. Hey, Salvador.
Hi, Matt. I really enjoyed most everything you had to say. I'm a professing Christian, but I can really identify with so much of what you said. I actually had bouts of agnosticism, and through my time spending time with atheists, I actually came back to the Christian faith. But I could really identify with so many of the things you asserted. Part of the reason I'm calling, and thank you for taking my questions. So I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on some things. I'm a part-time biology student, graduate student at the National Institutes of Health. One thing you said about science being the method of confirming things, I very much sympathize with that, and I relate to it, but there are a lot of phenomena that are not repeatable, and we accept as true, and even science will accept as true. And so at least two off the top of my head would be the origin of the universe and the origin of life. A lot of people, just from science alone, think these are very exceptional events, and they're not subject to repetition. And at what point is something so exceptional? How exceptional does a phenomenon have to be to qualify as miraculous? So I posed that question to many atheists, and a lot of them said, well, it could still be a natural phenomenon. What they really mean, God wasn't involved in it. And I accept that as their answer, but if that's the case, then it seems no phenomenon, no matter how exceptional, would qualify as miraculous. The other thing is, if one is requiring miracles to be repeated, that sort of destroys the idea it's a miracle. It's a law of physics or chemistry. So that's one of the reasons, as much as I sympathize with the skepticism, and I value the skepticism of the atheist, I came to a different conclusion. But anyway, I like the rest of pretty much everything you had to say, so thank you.
So I would say the fact that an occurrence is unique can never confirm that it's miraculous. I mean, so far as I'm aware, my birth was unique. It's the only time I've ever been born. That doesn't mean that it was miraculous. This is the only time this conversation has ever taken place to my knowledge. That doesn't make it miraculous. So the fact that something only occurs once doesn't make it miraculous.
Correct. Agreed.
So otherwise, like you were saying, that everything would be miraculous. So yeah, I'm in agreement that the fact that the origin of the universe and the origin of life aren't subjectable to repetition doesn't tell us whether or not we can conclude that they're miraculous. The same thing is true for other claims about miracles. It is not my fault, not that anybody would suggest that, it is not the fault of science or reality that a particular event can't be repeated. And if an event isn't subject to replication, then our confidence level in explanations about that event needs to be proportioned to that. So if something only occurs once, we can explore it. Granted, we don't have a time machine, but we can explore the ramifications of it. And we can come up with, tentative hypotheses about what might be a possible explanation for it. But it may be forever outside of our reach to confirm. And when I hear, and not necessarily accusing you of this, when this type of line of reasoning is presented, it's often taken one step further, because what you kind of said is, okay, miracles, if they were, easily repeated, wouldn't that make them non-miracles? Isn't there something about the fact that they can't be investigated or only occur once that is why we call them miracles? That might be the case for why we call them miracles, but that's completely independent of what they actually are and what the cause is. It's another way this comes about is people say, well, you're relying on science and God isn't subject to scientific investigation. I agree. So far as I can tell, I'm unaware of, any modern gods that people believe in who are truly subjected to scientific explanation. Certainly there are claims about gods. We've tested intercessory prayer and things like that. But the God concept, or the being itself as what it's proposed as, isn't subject to scientific testing. And the theist will say, God isn't subject to scientific testing, therefore you can't show that he doesn't exist. I agree. But it also means that if it's not subjectable to testing, if there's no way to quantify, if there's no way to verify that it happened or that it exists, then I don't see how one can have a rational foundation for belief. And it is, I know plenty of people who call themselves skeptics who don't have a great understanding of skepticism. I also know people who say, I'm a skeptic and I'm a Christian, or I'm a skeptic and I believe in a God. And their reason is skepticism has nothing to say about untestable claims. And my answer has been the same for years. Yes, it does. Skepticism can only, what skepticism would have to say about untestable claims is that by virtue of being untestable, we cannot possibly have sufficient evidence to justify believing the explanation. It's not, when you say that God isn't testable, it is an admission that we cannot have good reason to believe in God. It has not become a good reason to believe in God, because you could list all of the other propositions that are also untestable. And to be intellectually honest and consistent, you would have to believe all of those other things as well. If your reason for belief, and I'm not saying you, but if someone's reason for belief was this sort of thing isn't subject to the tests of science, so you would have to believe all those things.
Well, if I could share my perspective, and I thank you very much for your comment. Life does not only to me does life look like the origin of life being non-repeatable, it looks exceptional. It doesn't look like it was any ordinary event. I do have some background in statistics, and I actually was in the credits of a documentary about Christian gamblers who beat the casinos for 3.5 million.
I saw that documentary.
Oh, the Holy Rollers. Yes, you'll see my name in the credits.
I've seen Holy Rollers. I think it was on Netflix for a while.
I hope you liked it. I hope it did.
It was interesting.
Well, you could probably guess where I stand on Pascal's wager, but that's another topic. I just wanted to say, to me, life looks exceptional. The statistics.
I agree, but if something has happened once, and it looks exceptionally unlikely, even though we do know that the building blocks of life exist outside of Earth and the conditions that we suspect might have been, the fact that we can't reproduce an exact abiogenesis event that directly maps to what happened here on Earth doesn't mean that we're necessarily blocked. The field of abiogenesis, we don't know how life evolved here or how life began here, but we do know that the principal elements can be demonstrated under certain conditions. We don't necessarily know what our conditions are. But even if it happened once, and I would agree it's extraordinary, I don't know what conclusion you can draw from that. I don't know, when you talk about statistics and probability, you can say this is really, 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 really unlikely. Okay, fine. How likely is it that a God created it instead? You have no way to calculate that probability, so you can't compare to say which of those two is more probable. Oh,
agreed. And that lends to Pascal's wager, but I don't want to go there. But I do want to say
no.
I do want to say this. I think I heard you interview former pastors who became atheists. So
I'm starting to, yeah.
I thought those are very compelling, and really that's the end of my comments. I thank you for your time.
Great. And by the way, I've got like a 35-minute video on Pascal's wager and everything that's wrong with it, if you want to look at that.
If I have time, I will.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Matt. I really enjoyed you visiting. Thank you.
Thank you. And I see that Dargendorp's in here. Dargendorp, the official keeper of all things Matt. If you want to find any of the talks that I've given, or you can always go to my YouTube channel, but if you go to tinyurl.com/themmattlist, he has been diligent in every talk that I have that's up somewhere. He's posted there. So thank you so much for showing up again and being helpful in chat.
Thank you, Salvador. Now we have Josh up. He's a philosophy student over at Oxford University here in the UK. Go ahead, Josh.
Hey, Matt.
Hey, Josh.
Hi, I'm Josh. that I have got here late, and so I don't know how it quite started. I got here kind of midway through Blake. And so, yeah, there are lots of ways we could go with this. One of the things so you're talking with Blake about miracles. I think miracles are interesting, so we could go there for a bit. It's not difficult to say that would you say that we could be rational in believing that there were blind people who are no longer blind? And that kind of happened in a second without kind of some sort of scientific intervention.
All right. So there was a blind person who's no longer blind, and it happened in a second. Would we be rational in believing it? Not without more information.
Okay, so that if we had sufficient evidence for it. So, for example, I knew the blind person for years, and like I saw them, and then I saw them just before, and like they couldn't see, and then I saw them just after, and they could see, and like we could apply tests before.
Yeah, if we can verify, if I have verification that somebody I know, like my wife's mother, for example, is deaf.
Right.
We know she's deaf. She's been deaf from birth. If she showed up at my house and was able to hear and demonstrated, I would be perfectly rational in accepting that she can now hear.
Great. Okay, cool. That's cool. That's great. I hoped you at least would say that. That's fine. In terms of
determining what is rational is based entirely on the evidential support for it.
Right.
So it's not just your original one was somebody was blind and a minute later they weren't without the intervention of science.
Right. So I'm like, I'm with you. Like this is evidence that this isn't like, like this person in somewhere in the world and Peter and like kind of wires and all that. But I'm a fan of James Randi as well. So yeah. I think so. My next question would be that in terms of mechanisms for identifying miracles, one way that I would kind of think about it would be the following: that if we could have that we could have a situation, and this is dependent on evidence, and I'm not going to go into that because there are places where that's better documented than I can do in 30 seconds. But suppose we had that kind of evidence to say that blind people could see or that deaf people could hear and that kind of thing. If we had one theory that's predicting that, and that's going to take place, and even that will take place in specific circumstances like prayer or that kind of thing, then if we have another theory which really doesn't predict that at all, and that really doesn't predict that, then the other one theory is that you can call it better. I know you're not like huge a fan of kind of talking in truth terms in terms of science stuff, that's fine. But if it's like the theory that predicted that deaf people were going to hear and blind people were going to see, that would be a better theory than the other one. Would you agree with that?
Well, first of all, I don't know that I'm reluctant to call them theories, but for the sake of conversation, we can go that route. So this is basically on theism, this is more probable than on atheism.
Sure.
And I think it makes the mistake of saying that this is consistent with this particular hypothesis.
Right.
That doesn't mean that we have any good reason to think that hypothesis is correct. When we're demonstrating, causality, you need necessary and sufficient. And so while theism is a sufficient explanation, a particular version, the miracle working, healing of power of prayer model of Christianity would be sufficient to get that result. It may not be necessary to get that result. And if you compare it to on non-theism, I don't have any reason to think that because we've observed that it happened, that we can conclude that on theism or on non-theism it's any less likely. And we still haven't demonstrated anything about the necessity of either.
And so I'm slightly confused. I think I'm not sure where I've got confused, but so hang on. So taking theism, I would be like, this isn't, I'm quite happy to leave aside a generic Christian theism and go to a Christian theism that, let's say, that's saying certain things that would be a sufficient God to kind of create miracles, I think. And so I'm not sure.
It'd be sufficient. If you believe in a God that can do miraculous things, it's automatically sufficient that it can do miraculous things. That's by definition.
Right.
What I'm talking about is when we try to figure out what's the most probable explanation for this.
Okay.
And so when we do that, you can't just do like on theism versus on non-theism.
Right.
And in part, this gets back to the last call when I talked about the statistics for how incredibly improbable the origin of life might be. But we have no way to calculate how probable it is on a theistic model because we have no data for that. And so let's say my wife's mother regains her hearing and comes in. I would be fully happy to say, this happened. I believe that it happened. What is the explanation for this? And if there were people who were saying, our religion holds that if we pray for this to actually happen, it happens. And so it's more likely that our prayers cause this than any other explanation.
Sure.
And that is an error in a determining probability because you have not evaluated any other explanation. You have not evaluated every other explanation to say that yours is more likely. And you have no way to calculate how likely it is on your hypothesis of theism. You can just say it's consistent with it. But consistent with something doesn't get you to causality on its own. So my take on the miracle would be, if you'd like to call this a miracle in the sense that something has happened for which we don't have a natural explanation, okay, in that context, it's a miracle. But if you want to call it a miracle in the sense of something has happened and we have concluded that the best explanation is this supernatural intervention, then I can't accept that because that hasn't been demonstrated.
So I think there are criteria that you can use. So what I probably say is there are criteria you can use to say why a Christian explanation would be a better explanation in these cases. One would be that, it's, where was I going? It's just gone out of my head. That's a disaster. One would be that it happens in a specifically religious context. So if like people are becoming, we don't have, there aren't really, unless I kind of haven't found a large part of the world, that it doesn't tend to be the case that blind people who are like congenitally blind become not blind like ever. That just doesn't really happen. And so if that happens and like without some sort of miraculous scientific, some sort of new scientific operation, we expect that not to happen. So if like some people come along and they start praying about this, and then people who were blind become blind.
So you're slightly changing. You're slightly changing here.
Okay, so
we talked about we were talking about a single incident of this person, and now you're talking about basically testing the efficacy of prayer, where if we could show that congenitally blind people don't become seeing people, and there's this particular group of Christian people who are running around praying, laying on hands, and people start seeing, where we've got repetition. We don't just have like one anomaly. Then what we can say is there seems to be a causal link between their praying, laying on hands, whatever, and these people becoming seeing people. But we still, and I pointed this out earlier, we still don't know why it happened. We just have a connection, an incredibly strong correlation between this prayer and this event.
Right.
Is it because they are praying to the one true correct God? Does it mean that everything else they believe in their theology is also correct? Or is there something that we don't know about the particular mechanisms of this type of prayer that results in this? It's not, one of the things is that people get so frustrated when I do this because they're like, oh, you are dead set to never accept, God and the supernatural. And that's not remotely the case, because if God shows up right here, I'm going to believe that, he could make me believe right off the bat. And I'm open to it. But what I'm not open to doing is accepting more than what is actually justified. And so if we showed, for example, intercessory prayer from this particular group, or even a broad group, whatever the data shows, I'm willing to accept that is what happens. And if I had a friend who was blind, I would pray or find those people who do that to help them out. But the fact that they believe that their prayer can heal the blind and it works, or it appears to work, appears amazingly strong correlation, doesn't mean that their other beliefs about gods or supernaturals or afterlife or anything are also correct. But what's most important to me is the scenario we're hypothesizing never happens. We never have this sort of scenario to investigate. There is not an incident of a whole bunch of blind people gaining their sight through the intervention of prayer. If we could test this, then I would agree that we could come to some conclusions. But not only can we not get to the further conclusions about, the other foundations within their theology, we can't even get to that point because it just doesn't happen.
So the two main points there. One is that even if you get all this kind of stuff about blind people who are seeing, that still, you can't draw from that the conclusion that God did it. I think that's basically what you're trying to say there. I think what I'd want to say is that it's a thing of that when a theory predicts two things, or predicts multiple things, and parts of it are confirmed, then we're rational in kind of just by process of induction, being like, it predicts these things have happened, therefore we trust the rest of it. That's the reasoning, and that's kind of the way I see it. On the kind of, in terms of people who are blind, who weren't seeing and not seeing, I highly recommend Craig Keener's Miracles. If you haven't read it, really, really interesting.
What's the name of the author?
Keener. So Craig Keener, he's Keener. It's a 1,200 page work. Basically, and he goes through kind of scientific journal articles on so for example, the study of the effects of proximal intercessory prayer in Mozambique, in the Southern Medical Journal, and lots and lots of others. You may be familiar with that.
I haven't read the book, but I am familiar with the book. I've seen the book and I've seen it discussed.
Right. Right. So that would be that I kind of wasn't particularly looking to get into the evidence, because I think
it'd be overwhelming. The thing is, if this were actual evidence, it would be science by now, and the guy would have gotten a Nobel Prize picking out, individual.
But I've had people have said that to me before, and that I basically don't buy it, because I think that there are lots of things that have been good things in the past that have been rejected, and that's kind of Christian Science, atheist side.
That's a fallacy, though, that this is then something that should not be rejected, because there are a lot of things in the past that have been rejected which should have been rejected.
Sure, so, I agree. So it just means you have to investigate it rather than.
Yeah, we would have to investigate it. And what we don't seem to have are those investigations like we talked about, which would only lead to this. The thing you said where, if a theory predicts a couple of different things, that if it predicted three things and the first two are confirmable, then the third one's confirmable. I reject that. It depends on what are the demonstrated connections between those things, because you could have a theory that predicts that A will happen and B will happen and C will happen, and it could be right about A and B, but there could be an error that prevents it from being correct about C. So while we might say that we have a strong likelihood that this sort of thing might in fact be true, the time to believe it is when it's actually been demonstrated to most probably be correct, and not just not impossible.
So something like divine hiddenness, you would say, is a good evidence against God.
Divine hiddenness is my most common argument lately.
Right, and so kind of listen to your debate with Blake on that kind of thing.
Yeah.
You would say that, I know that you're kind of reticent to how far you go from being an agnostic or being an atheist, that I'm not particularly bothered about that. But what I'd say is that you say that there are lots of, if you are saying that is one thing that's predicted by atheism, you also then...
Atheism doesn't make any predictions.
So, atheism
is the label. Atheism is a response. There's a claim. You either believe that a God exists or you don't. Now, are there things that, for strong atheism, I believe there are no gods, the anti-theist position, there would be predictions from that.
Okay, so strong atheism, fine.
Yeah.
That if you take I think you do. I know you often are somewhere in the middle, but I think you do. You would consider. Would you? In fact, I'll ask. Would you consider yourself a strong atheist?
Depending, as I said earlier, depending very much on definitions, I am a strong atheist.
Fine.
But it's not in the sense of is it? Am I saying it's impossible? Or I'm certainly not claiming absolute certainty, because I reject that entirely.
Yeah, that's fine.
I'm not saying it's impossible that out in the realm of things we don't know, that there's something that might eventually qualify as a God. I just don't happen to believe that it's true. And given what we understand and the baggage that comes with the God label, I think it's probably not true.
Right. So the point that I want to make is that you would take divine hiddenness as the strongest argument there. There are lots of other claims that strong atheism entails, and lots of other probably other predictions there. Or yes, there are other predictions of strong atheism, things like not every good is going to be redeemed, or those a lot of other kind of things that come with that. And from divine hiddenness, you would infer a lot of other things. That for me, that would just be kind of an example of how that works on your theory, and that similarly.
But divine hiddenness is only a response to particular God models, because it's only a response to interventionist gods, or gods that care about or could interact. It's not a response to, for example, a purely deistic model, or a first cause that no longer interacts. So it's not an argument against all gods. It is a response to claims of gods that are purportedly manifesting in reality and showing that they don't.
So yeah, I think that they're like, it depends on the kind of version of divine hiddenness you're using. That I think you use a different version to Schellenberg. But like that's fine. But yeah, I think that's like. But even I mean, would you phrase divine hiddenness as a positive piece of evidence then?
So the argument for divine hiddenness, even Schellenberg's version, where he specifically defines characteristics of God.
Yes, he does.
It is an argument against the gods that would fit under those definitions.
Sure.
Is it absolute confirmation that they don't exist? No. My thing about my version of divine hiddenness, and the reason I avoid Schellenberg's and others, is about this idea of a relationship. Because when you look at things like morality or intervention, why wouldn't God, problem of evil and things that work their way in some sense into divine hiddenness, you're assuming that you know enough about the situation to determine what a God would do. And you're basically saying that there is no set of circumstances under which a God would not intervene here. And I don't buy into that. I think that it's not impossible that a God could have a good reason to not intervene in a situation where we might expect it. Okay. Mine only addresses this idea of a relationship, because I absolutely know what it's like to be in a relationship with another thinking agent.
Right.
I also know what it's like when an agent expresses an interest in being in a relationship with me. Right. And that has not happened, which isn't a confirmation that a God doesn't exist. It is a confirmation that either God doesn't exist or he doesn't currently want a relationship with me. In either case, that's not my problem. That's
okay. So that's
it is a response
to that. Like that's kind of the way you phrase the argument. That's fine.
And it's a response to the people who are saying constantly that God does in fact want a relationship with me. It's more a claim that they are incorrect in their assessment of either God's existence or what he wants.
Sure, and that's fine. I think the point that I'm trying to make, a very narrow point here on this, and the point is that you would take from divine hiddenness more than just. Yeah, I think there are other things that within a theory that are irrational for you. If let's say your version of divine hiddenness worked, there would be more things than just that particular. Yeah, I don't. Well, in fact, I don't know. But I think there are. You could draw other predictions about the world from that.
Well, they would all be predictions about. If my argument is against a God who people say want a relationship with me, anything else you could draw from that would stem from that particular God model.
Right.
It's still all responsive. All of atheism, it's not. And by the way, it's not about creating arguments to disprove God. It's about exposing the fallacies involved with the arguments that attempt to prove that a God exists. And likewise, if, you know, we can sit here all day and say, well, I think that if the First Baptist Church of Oxford decided to lay hands on people and they repeatedly healed people, that this would be evidence of God. And I would say that alone in and of itself is not confirmation of God, but it is in fact evidence that the First Baptist Church of Harvesters methods are working, but we don't yet know why. Now, the only way we can start to assess why is to have some ability to calculate or even approximate the probabilities of different explanations. And when it comes to the God proposals, we don't have any data to work from. So somebody can go out and write a 1,000-page tome about unexplained events in science, and they can reach the conclusion that, in their opinion, the best explanation is that a God did it. But I don't see how that opinion can actually be justified, because they have no way to determine how likely it is that a God can or does intervene in reality and do this. And they don't have sufficient knowledge to rule out other possibilities.
So I think my difficulty is with this, and I think I'll leave it at this after this, that it seems to me that a natural explanation is, so what you're holding to would be something like, and correct me if I'm wrong at any point, but a natural explanation is always preferable to a supernatural explanation.
No.
No.
A natural explanation is always preferable to a supernatural explanation until such time as supernatural explanations demonstrate that they are possible and that we can assess their probability.
We didn't even go to possible stuff. But yeah, that's a whole another thing that I'd love to do that. But yeah. Okay. I don't know that. I don't see what for me that these kind of cases are ways that you can assess the probability. That I say that one theory says this is going to happen, and so then that raises the probability of it as a result. That for me is just the kind of the very demonstration of probability. But fine. Well, good to chat. Thanks so much.
It's strange because there are countless different religions with different gods.
Yep.
And any one of them could get bits and pieces right, and yet we're wrong. And believers have opted for a particular version of a religion, and seem to be confident that theirs is the most probable, without ever demonstrating any way to determine which is more probable, which is more likely, that the Christian God is correct, that the Muslim God is correct.
I can answer that briefly on that something like, so I mean, there are lots of answers to this. One, on something like Islam, my very simple answer is that Islam predicts a lot of things which are false. So, for example, Surah 4, verse 157 says that they did not kill him, they did not crucify him. So
Tyr is still here as well.
Sorry?
Tyr still exists. It was supposed to be wiped from existence. I mean, we can do the same thing either way. But it's one of those things where what I'm saying is, here's a list of things within this religion. And if this particular religion got 60% things correct, this one got 20%, this one got 80%, this one got 5%, that you can assess how correct or how accurate each of those are.
Yep.
But the areas where they either haven't gotten it correct or we do not know the answer, you cannot determine what the likelihood that those are actually correct. Because it could be the case that 60% that they got correct is their limit, or 90% is their limit.
I mean, I'd say that about any worldview, that kind of whether.
Yeah, and that's why I'm with Hume, that the wise man apportions his belief to the evidence. Sure. I believe things to the extent to which they are supported by evidence, and I'm not going to be convinced, certainly not to bet my life or an afterlife on, well, this religion got these things right, so it's probable that they got this other thing right too. I mean, that model is absolutely useless for me.
Okay, so I think it would depend on the kind of strength of the claim that's being made. That something like miracles happen.
Well, if I told you 9 true things in a row,
Yep.
You bet your entire life savings that the 10th thing I say is true.
Depends on what the things you told me were, and depends on the context. So some of the Darren Brown stuff, very interesting.
Yeah,
but that's the point.
System earlier.
That's the point. Yeah, that kind of, I'm a fan of Darren Brown as well. That kind of
he's the best living mentalist right now. Which I guess right now becomes redundant since I said living.
Yeah, right. And yeah, I think it depends on context, and you've got to be assessing all these kinds of explanations. But I don't think that. So something that those are much more easily replicable things. And now we're able to assess our cognitive biases because we've watched Darren Brown. We can be like, oh, that's a problem. That those things are bad because, and we can apply criteria. But for example, if you had demonstrated your ability as an investor 9 times out of 10, and you showed me the ways in which you've done it, and there are lots of good things, and you were able to demonstrate all these things to me, and you'd done it that I'd kind of steadily increased the money, that I'd invested in you in the 10th time.
You would fall prey to the exact thing that Darren Brown proposed in the system, because while he used horse races, this con is most frequently done with stock market investments.
Fine, but that's again, I'm trying to apply many criteria as possible. That we can, the more criteria we can apply here, the better the evidence. So that if you can show me the way in which this works, how you're making this money, why this is going to continue to work, all these kind of things, that on the 10th one, that will be fine.
So you want a robust explanation for each of those things?
No, I want a reasonable explanation. I want a kind of, or at least I want good predictions.
Each individual prediction is a data point, but the explanation behind the individual occurrences is what you're really after to determine how likely it is that this is a good system that you would buy into.
Well, maybe I'm not sure. I don't want to commit myself to any huge epistemological things here.
It's good, because that would have completely destroyed religion had you said yes. Because the sort of evidence that you're looking for, that you would consider rational, if you showed me how the system worked and why it worked and everything else, the sort of things that you would require in order to invest your entire life savings, even after getting 8, 9, 10 good stock tips in a row, that is the sort of evidence that I'm looking for with regard to religion, and I don't see it. And when I have discussions with people, not only do they not ever present it, but they are simultaneously betting their life, their current life, and perhaps potential afterlives on insufficient evidence. And that's why I can't believe.
Okay, so I think that, and so I probably wouldn't want to make the thing about, do I need a complete explanation of everything that I do there? No, but I think we make, the kind of, even like a stock market thing aside, there are plenty of things that very big things, so something like an operation, that I don't understand everything that's going on in an operation, but I see people going in and out of the operation room, and that's fine.
But there are plenty of things I don't understand. There are plenty of things I don't understand, but I know people who I am convinced understand them, and I am willing to accept that they're more likely correct because I value.
So couldn't you say the same about the investor?
No, because sorry, but say the same about what?
The investor. That if you're saying that about a doctor, why is it? It's that if a doctor, that you've seen people going in and out of the doctor's room lots and lots of times and that kind of thing, that's been fine in the past, therefore I go in for an operation.
Yeah, no, and that would be the case for both. I don't see that with regard to theology.
But the point is, you don't have a complete explanation in the operation.
It's not about having a complete explanation. It's about having any explanation, any demonstration of plausibility that I could even understand. Theologians have demonstrated expertise in nothing real or demonstrable. Priests and ministers, while they do,
begging the question, that just begs the question about it.
It doesn't beg the question. It's a recognition of the truth. It's not the fault of reason that a God claim does not subject itself to reasonable inquiry.
And that's kind of begging the question against everything that's been said so far.
It's not begging the question.
But that's fine. I'll leave it there. That's fine.
It would be begging the question if I was asserting that a God doesn't exist but I'm talking about not accepting the claim that a God does exist. It has not met its burden of proof. That is not in any way circular reasoning to acknowledge that something has not met its burden of proof.
So that, but I think that I'm not saying that you're assuming from that God does not exist. That it's, the point is that mechanisms have been proposed, and so I proposed a mechanism. There are lots of other people who propose mechanisms or arguments and things, and so yeah.
I didn't hear you propose any mechanism that was reasonable, but
okay, fine. Well, thanks very much. Thanks for chatting.
Thanks.
Thank you, Josh. We have currently 3 people with hands raised.
I'm not very good at being succinct, but these are kind of like miniature debate discussions.
Yes. Are you good to keep going, Matt?
Yeah, we can keep going a bit. I definitely would want to be done. Well, we go ahead and go like 40 minutes, but I don't want to bore people to tears, and I have a dinner to prepare after that. So.
Sure. Yeah, we all enjoy this. I'll bring up Bill Cole. Hey, Bill.
Hello.
How's it going?
Yeah, good. How are you, Jonathan?
I'm pretty good. You're on with Matt.
Matt, very interesting discussion, and I really appreciate how you approach the issues. My primary interest has been in the theory of evolution, and I know, and I spend most of my time on the blogging side, on the more atheist type of blogs, and more people who support the theory of evolution. I'm extremely skeptical at this point. You had made a statement about string theory, and maybe we could start out there, because I think comparing the two would be very interesting.
Yeah. So the easy comparison is that evolution has made predictions which are borne out, and string theory perhaps hasn't. But I don't necessarily need to contrast them, because I am not remotely an expert in either, although I'm probably more familiar with evolution. So evolution by natural selection is the cornerstone of biology, and it is supported by so much evidence that at this point, like any other scientific model or theory, we could find out that it is wrong. Unfortunately, there are some things that have such a wealth of evidence behind them and such a predictive power that finding out that they were wrong becomes, nearly miraculous, because what we would like to find is that aspects of it may not be correct, but that on the whole, the model is what we think it is.
This may be too deep for this discussion, but I disagree with you entirely on every point, and it gets back into origin of life, because I think the movement
origin of life has nothing to do with evolution.
Sure, it does. The genome
absolutely doesn't. The theory of evolution by natural selection begins after life begins and talks about the diversity of life on Earth. It does not say anything at all about abiogenesis.
I'm making a different statement. What I'm saying is the problems with origin of life move their way. The problems that create the extreme probability problems of origin of life are the same problems that create the probability problems in evolution. It's the fact that the genome is a sequence. It's the largest mathematical space in the universe, and a theory that says you can mutate through it is nonsense. And
there's no such thing as genetic mutation?
Mutate it to function.
So
mutate it to a functional protein. Mutate it to a functional protein complex. How do you make a functional protein complex? But maybe this is, let's not go here because let's just not go here, because we can agree to disagree at this point. Let me ask you a different question, right? Which is, and I don't mean to. I just think it's too. It removes us from the subject at hand. What do you think, from an atheist standpoint, how important is the theory of evolution philosophically, from the philosophical atheist standpoint?
Not at all. I agree with Dawkins that it allowed non-theists to be intellectually fulfilled on the subject of biology, but it is completely separate from whether or not there's a God, which is why many God believers accept the evolution model. Evolution is not an atheistic thing. Evolution is accepted. I mean, Francis Collins, the head of the Human Genome Project, who's an evangelical Christian, head of the Human Genome Project, and is completely on board, and has said, by the way, that the confirmation of common descent or common ancestor is confirmed in the biology of the genome, absent any fossil evidence. And so the atheism, evolution, the model of evolution, is not in any way an atheistic thing. You don't have to be an atheist to accept it. And it tells you nothing about whether there's a God, because it's not necessarily impossible that there's a God who used the natural processes to, or even, you know, I don't see any room for manipulation, but I can't rule it out as a possibility when we're talking about a God model that I have no knowledge of. So this,
right.
You could prove evolution is wrong tomorrow, and I still have no reason to believe in a God.
Okay, that's really what I wanted to see, is how you were connecting the two, and so that's why I didn't want to get into a debate of evolution or no evolution. So
yeah.
Anyway, that's great. Thank you, and thank you for your explanation.
Sure, thanks.
Yeah.
I'd also recommend going to talkorigins.org for the Index to Creationist Claims, which I'm sure you're probably familiar with, and a lot of people have investigated. But there's another, you know, Jerry Coyne's book, Why Evolution is True. There's a great website for Princeton that talks about evolution. But at the end of the day, if we had a new, so one of the things that kind of ties to this in a separate sense is the origin of the universe, and Big Bang cosmology in particular. We could find out this afternoon that our entire Big Bang model is wrong. And depending on what we find out, it would not in any way change my position on whether or not a God exists. As a matter of fact, I have a friend who's a physicist who wrote the quantum mechanics textbook used here at UT and other universities, had the office right down the hall from Weinberg, who is currently doing the math to confirm someone's alternate possibility to the current standardized Big Bang model. Whether or not it turns out to be correct or not is anybody's guess. I didn't become an atheist because I got convinced of evolution or Big Bang cosmology. I'm an atheist because the God claims haven't met their burden of proof.
Great. Let me just ask you a question, Matt, just off the back of that. I've seen you talk about in one of your videos about the design argument in relation to both cosmic fine-tuning and in terms of what the life sciences. Mm-hmm. And you've criticized the concept of specified complexity as not being a meaningful concept. Is that a fair representation of your view?
Well, it depends on what you mean by not being meaningful. I mean, I don't want it to seem as if it's an incoherent idea. Yeah. I don't accept it because, first of all, evolution doesn't have this idea of an intent or a goal. It's not striving towards something.
Right.
And to say that a function is so specific or so narrow in its function that the best explanation is that it was specified or it points to an intelligence is something that I just don't accept.
Right. So that, like, the sort of Dembskian concept of specified complexity, you don't like that.
No.
Yeah. Okay. And you've pointed out that your existence is immensely improbable, but that doesn't mean that your existence is actualized by intent. Right. As a counter argument to the concept of specified complexity, I wondered, because I actually wrote a blog post responding to your video on design. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but one of the responses that I made to that particular point that you raised was that by the same reasoning, you would also have to throw away most of the arguments for the proposition of common ancestry. For example, take the argument from molecular variance patterns. For example, the netted hierarchical distribution of, shared base substitutions and mobile element inserts between different lineages. Now, biologists recognize that netted hierarchical distribution cries out for an explanation beyond chance. But the but why is that the case? The probability of exactly the same substitutions and integrations occurring in the genomes of different lineages independently by chance is equivalent to any combination of substitutions and integrations, yet the common ancestry hypothesis is favored over the chance hypothesis because of the specificity in addition to the improbability. So it's not merely that it's improbable, it's also that it conforms to some independently given pattern. And so would you not have to throw away the common ancestry arguments by the same on the same basis that you throw away the specified complexity concept?
No, because the specified complexity is basically saying that there is no natural explanation. There has to be some sort of intelligent intervention in this. We can tell this because of the function. And the arguments for common ancestry, I mean, they don't depend on any of that, because evolution is not merely chance. The model is the theory of evolution by means of natural selection. And so the pressures on which organisms are going to survive or thrive take random mutations, which may not all necessarily be random, but you could be random mutations, and those which are not overly detrimental survive. So the question here is not one of if we throw out intelligent guidance, that we must then throw out all guidance. No, because the model is about natural selection. The natural environment that the organisms are trying to survive to pass on their genes, that is the selector. Evolution is not merely chance.
Of course.
It is chance with this.
Right.
And I would say that, you know, I mean, obviously you've got the Steve project that shows, you know, biologists named Steve. I'll set all that aside. For me, and I'll agree with Francis Collins and others, Ken Miller, who's a Catholic and was in the Dover trial, talking about the fusion of chromosome 2 is one of the clearest demonstrations of common ancestry, and it has nothing to do with, you know, I don't even see that it falls into the objections that you're launching. But I'm not a biologist.
Right. I am, but
all of this is from a bad one.
Yeah. I mean, specified complexity doesn't itself, you know, it's not like specified complexity is definitionally the product of design. It's not that specified complexity, and intelligent design theorists would argue, is best explained by intelligent design. But
how can you say that something is best explained by intelligent design?
Okay, so basically the intelligent design inference, as formulated by design theorists, is predicated upon the standard historical principles of scientific reasoning about the past. The historical abductive method, pioneered by Charles Lyell and his principles of geology, you know, the present is the key to the past. And so, as Charles Lyell argued, that if you want to explain events in the remote past, you let your present experience of cause and effect guide your search for that best explanation. So in the case of the information-bearing properties of DNA and RNA, in every realm of experience, or uniform repeated experience of the cause and effect structure of the world, information is uniformly associated with conscious activity. And so when we find information intrinsic to the hereditary molecule...
That's circular. You can't say that without assuming an intelligent designer to begin with.
Why is it circular?
Why is it circular? Because you are looking at the entirety. You are looking at the entirety of life and saying there's information in all of this, and arguing by analogy that where we encounter information, it comes from an intelligence, therefore it also came from intelligence here. That is, in fact, a fallacy.
No, it's not.
If you're going to talk about what's more probable, that it was more probable by an intelligence, what you would need is to be able to demonstrate a situation where a confirmed intelligence was demonstrated as the actual cause for some change in life.
But information generally is associated with intelligent causes, and I would argue that evolutionary chance and necessity mechanisms are demonstrably insufficient causally to explain this type of phenomena, whereas we do know of a type of cause or category of explanation known to produce information-rich systems. And so I think that we are quite justified.
Are you saying that a random mutation couldn't add information?
Well, I do think that random genetic mutations are sufficient to explain specified complexity. I mean, there's different definitions of information, of course. but I don't think that you can produce significant amounts of specified complexity.
Okay. So if random mutations are sufficient to explain specified complexity, then we don't have an issue.
Exactly, but I would reject that premise.
You just offered it.
No, I said I would reject that random genetic mutation can explain specified complexity.
I thought, I don't know, maybe I heard it wrong. I thought you just said that you would accept.
No, I'm sorry. I think either I misspoke or you misheard me. Sorry. But yeah, I would reject that premise. I think, for example, looking at protein structures, what's required to explain fundamentally new protein structures, you need a huge amount of specificity. For example, you're probably familiar with the work of, or you may be familiar with the work of Doug Axe of the Biologic Institute, and he's published a number of papers. One of the most classic of which is his paper in 2004 in the Journal of Molecular Biology, where at the time he was a postdoctoral researcher at Cambridge, and he looked at a particular enzyme complex known as beta-lactamase, which is an enzyme involved in conferring antibiotic resistance, looking at a particular domain of this enzyme complex, which is 150 amino acids long, in terms of its primary structure, and he basically performed a site-directed mutagenesis experiment where he randomly altered the amino acid composition, and according to his work, which is published in the Journal of Molecular Biology, the ratio of functional to non-functional protein structures within combinatorial space is 1 in 10 to the 74th power. And
sure. So this is one of those things that just irritates the crap out of me, and it's not directed at you, is people keep talking about they've concluded that random mutation is not sufficient to explain this. And then they just talk about how unlikely it is. And this will get back to what I said probably over an hour ago. Telling me how unlikely something is absolutely useless, unless you also tell me how unlikely your proposed explanation is, because we have to compare the two to say which is more likely. Saying that something is incredibly improbable, vastly improbable, does not in any way support somebody else's hypothesis of how it happened, unless they can demonstrate that this hypothesis is in fact more probable.
But we can demonstrate a causal link between specified complexity and intelligence.
Intelligence as an origin for specified complexity?
For example, if an astronaut were to find a hieroglyphic inscription on the backside of the moon, for example, they would be justified in inferring design, irrespective of whether they knew who that intelligent agency was or how they should be there.
Right. Do you know why?
Go ahead.
Because all of the evidence of that particular thing points to it having had been created intelligently, and there is no evidence for it occurring naturally. But when we talk about evolution, the change in species the change in allele frequencies over time, that is naturally occurring.
It is naturally occurring. But the contestable premise is that the change in allele frequencies over time is causally sufficient to explain life's complexity and diversity.
No. It's not a claim that this is necessarily sufficient. The intelligent design community is claiming that it is insufficient. Mm-hmm. And they have a burden of proof to establish that they haven't. So as soon as they demonstrate that it is in fact insufficient, that they have an explanation which is sufficient, then that's the time at which we should accept intelligent design.
And do you not have to shoulder a burden of proof to show that it is sufficient?
All we have to do is show that this is what's actually occurring. If the assumption is that this, until additional information is presented, is the entirety of what we know, not the entirety of what's happening. I can't tell you that a God hasn't monkeyed with a genome, because I have no way to investigate that, no way to determine what the probability is, and no reason to presume it any more than I would for presuming that universe creating pixies are monkeying with it, or that there are invisible angels who come in, or leper gnomes that are coming in and tweaking the genome.
And I think, Matt, that we do have positive reason to think that random genetic mutations are causally insufficient. I mentioned, for example, the rarity of protein structures, and you can compound.
You can't say it's insufficient just by saying it's rare or improbable. I don't know how many times I can explain the same thing. You have to demonstrate that there is a more probable explanation. So there's an example where I take a deck of cards and I can shuffle it and I can deal it out, and you will get 13 spades. That's incredibly improbable. And so you could conclude that I cheated, but we also know that it can happen without cheating, because the mechanisms by which a deck is shuffled don't require cheating for that circumstance to result.
But we can demonstrate the insufficiency of one mechanism without necessarily having to posit another, correct?
Can you demonstrate the insufficiency of one mechanism? Only if you have exhaustive knowledge about that mechanism and there's something about it that necessarily shows that it can't do this. Like, you know, I know everything about how my car functions, so it isn't a transformer.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's not going to turn into a robot that's going to storm the city, because we can tell that the things that would be required for it to turn into a robot don't exist, or at least don't exist in any way that we can detect. You know, if you want to talk about how it can magically turn into a robot and march on Austin, okay, but now you've adopted a burden of proof about something, and then it has to be met. So there's a presumption, and none of this is absolute certainty, but there's the idea of parsimony, that not just the simplest explanation is the best, but that we shouldn't Occam's razor, not multiplying entities unnecessarily. So if we have a natural mechanism which appears to be doing this, positing additional explanations, adding to that, those additions have a burden of proof that has to be met. And you can't merely do that by saying this is really, really, really unlikely. You would have to show that it is in fact impossible.
I don't think you cannot show that something's impossible. Anything's possible, but is it plausible?
No. It's not the fault of the model that you can't show it's impossible. If you can't show it's impossible, then you don't have any reason to say that it doesn't.
This is a maneuver that Charles Darwin played in 1859 when he published The Origin of Species, where he said if it could be demonstrated that any organ existed which could not possibly be explained by numerous slight successive variations, then my theory would absolutely break down. Of course, it's not possible to show that something's impossible.
Tough. That's not a problem with the model, because there are models. There are situations where you can demonstrate that something would not be possible. You don't get to say that because we can't demonstrate it's impossible, all of a sudden it becomes possible, and all of a sudden more plausible that there's an intelligent designer. It just doesn't work that way.
Sorry, I will be right back. Oh, give me 1 second.
Hi, chat. Guten Abend.
Sorry.
What about my book? The book's called If I Were God, and I'm hoping to have it out by Christmas, but who knows?
Where were we? So there are I think multiple challenges to evolutionary theory which compound one another. I mean,
if that's the case, then what you should do is engage in this conversation with an evolutionary biologist.
Yeah, which I do, by the way.
Yeah, I'm not that.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Let's move on to someone else then. Let's bring up Jason McCool. Hey, Jason.
Hello. Hey, I just had a question for Matt on, he had mentioned earlier how, I guess, opposed he was to the whole notion of faith. And I was just curious, how exactly do you define faith?
Faith is the excuse people give for believing something when they don't have a good reason.
Okay. I think most Christians would also agree with you on that that's a bad reason. That's not our definition of faith.
Oh, I know.
Okay.
The problem is that it really is kind of on board. So in the Bible, faith is the evidence of things hoped for and not seen. Faith isn't evidence. So when you say that you believe on faith, what do you mean by faith?
I view faith as trust based on evidence.
That's trust.
Well, trust
based on evidence is something we all use. Now, what is the evidence? Because the evidence is the good reason part of this. What is the evidence for believing?
Well, for me, the evidence for theism in general is second law of thermodynamics, information theory, and let's see what else. Oh, and just the idea of design. I mean, I'm a structural engineer, so I design things every day.
Yep.
I have never once seen design without any kind of intelligent agency behind it. Things don't design themselves. Okay.
I haven't either. But that doesn't mean that you get to call things designed. You have to demonstrate that they're designed. I haven't seen things that were designed that weren't designed by an intelligence. I've seen things with the appearance of design that weren't done by an intelligence. There are plenty of incredible rock structures that are purely natural with wind and water erosion that could give the appearance of design. Certainly, you could look at different examples in life and see order and complexity that might give you the appearance of design, but you have not confirmed design. You are assuming design, and I don't know what the justification is.
Okay, well...
And I don't know what the second law of thermodynamics has to do with proving that a God exists.
Well, the second law of thermodynamics is that the entropy in the universe or in any closed system always increases.
Yeah.
So that basically we see that played out in everywhere in life. I mean, my coffee gets cold when I want it to be warm. From that to my car rusting. I mean.
I'm familiar with what it is. I just don't know how you get to God from it.
Okay. So the universe is running down. We know that.
Yeah.
Okay. So it can't have been running down eternally. There had to be a beginning point.
I'm first of all, not a cosmologist. My position isn't that the universe is eternal.
Okay. Good. I mean, we agree on that then.
Okay.
But you have to have some cause for the universe. I mean,
there has to be an explanation for why the universe exists.
Yes.
Okay. Why on earth, or why in any world, would you reach the conclusion that the explanation for why the universe exists is that there's a God, and not something that is sufficient to result in a universe?
Well, because the cause for the universe, it has to be something outside of space and time.
How do you know that?
Because space and time came into existence with the start of the universe.
Possibly.
Well, I mean, if Einstein's theories are true, then time and space are related, and
local time and space, but that doesn't necessarily mean the entirety of everything.
Well, that's just kicking the can down the road, though. I mean, let's just expand our.
I'm fine with kicking the can down the road, because the real explanation to what started the universe is I don't know. If you claim that you do know that it is a God, then you have to actually demonstrate it. I have no idea why there is a universe or how it began. I'm not offering an explanation for it. I'm just not accepting arguments from ignorance as fallacies as a justification for claiming that God did it, because the universe, the beginning of the universe, is something that we cannot investigate. So we can't know what it takes. We have exactly one universe. We don't have other universes to compare this to, so we don't know anything about how universes begin, what the requirements are. We have no idea whether it needs to be something intelligent or not. But even if we could infer that an intelligence is required to start the universe, that doesn't mean that there's an intelligence still existing. See, this is the problem that people get to. They see, oh, I see the appearance of design, and there had to have been something that started the universe. And oh my gosh, I don't just want to kick the can down the road when you have no reason to not think. I mean, Sagan wrote in response to people claiming that you would just have to keep questioning infinitely, so you must put some stop in there. His response was, why stop? To pretend that you know something, or pretend that you have an explanation for something that we agree, I would hope, is unexplained.
Now, would you not agree that an infinite regress would be a fallacy?
I don't know. Because you're looking at an infinite regress, and it may not necessarily be the case. If it's possible for something to be eternal that generates universes, then we don't have a problem. The difference is, I'm not willing to tell you anything about the qualities or properties of that thing, whether it's a multiverse or a superverse or a universe generating object that is eternal. You, on the other hand, are saying, I believe that the universe generating thing is eternal, and it's a thinking agent, and it still exists, and probably on down the line into it came down in bodily form as Jesus.
Well, to think that it still exists, I mean, if it's something that was eternal, then it's going to still exist.
You can have eternal one directional. You can have one directional eternal.
Okay.
Is it impossible for God to stop existing?
Yes, because if he's a necessary being, then yes, it is impossible for him to stop existing.
No. Is he? So now you're saying that he's not only necessary for the origin of the universe, but he's necessary to sustain it?
Yes,
because
a necessary being would be by definition. Yeah.
So, no, you get to define what you mean by necessary, because you could have a being, anything that is necessary for the origin of the universe, but not necessary. Its existence is not necessary to continue sustaining it. For example, I could create a painting, and I am necessary in the creation of the painting, but I don't have to keep existing in order for the painting to keep existing.
Right, because you're not a necessary being.
I'm
metaphysically. What I mean is a metaphysically necessary being.
How did you prove that there's a metaphysically necessary being?
Well, we know that the universe had a beginning, so there has to be something that caused that to exist, but it's outside of space and time, if those came into existence with the universe. So there has to be something outside of space and time. If it's outside of time, it's got to be eternal. So
you're confusing local temporal with non-local temporality.
And what is local versus non-local temporality?
There's space and time in our universe. What if there are other universes where there's also space and time that are running independent from ours? And what if they're a part of a superset of universes that has its own space and time, which are inhabited by those?
Then I would say that we're not defining universe correctly, because a universe is the whole scope of everything physical.
So there's our universe, and then yes, we've been using the word universe incorrectly for ages, which is why Sagan went with cosmos. So the universe inhabits the cosmos.
Well, then the universe is just, I mean, if you just, let's just call these a step above galaxies, say, let's just pick a name for it and then say, okay, the universe is the collection of all of these. And the universe is going to be the collection of all physical objects.
The problem here is that we begin with this assumption that the universe we inhabit is all there is and ever was and ever will be. And that's a mistake, or potentially a mistake, which is why Sagan said the cosmos is what we're going to use as the label for everything. So when you talk about space-time in our universe, that's definitely the universe, but we've expanded our understanding that that's not necessarily the sum total of everything. And the only reason we stick with that label is because that's the label we started with, which is why I talk about local space-time within the local universe. I'm not saying there are other universes. I just don't know that there's not. And when you start talking about, oh, there had to be this, and it had to be that, and it had to be that, you're making all kinds of claims about something that you cannot possibly know, because you have no way of knowing what it takes to create the universe we live in.
Okay. But I mean, the whether we call it local space-time or I don't know what else you'd call it, global space-time seems kind of
that's earthy.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I mean, what I'm saying is, if space-time, or the collection of all space-time realities, basically all of reality, whether you're talking this locality or another locality or the collection of all localities, you're saying that something has to start all of that, not just this little local section.
No. I'm not saying something has to start all that. I don't know.
Well, that would be your universe generating machine, right?
No, let's assume that there's a super universe. I don't want to use multiverse because that's actually got scientific connotations that I'm not necessarily fine with anyway. So we'll say the super universe. There is something out there, and it generates at least our universe. Who knows? Maybe others. What do we know about that super universe? Because you seem to be saying that we can know characteristics of that super universe such that we can define it as a necessary being that has thoughts and intentions, and I don't know how you got to any of those, because you look at all the classical arguments for the existence of God that are in the cosmological realm. The only thing they get to, like the Kalam, the conclusion is, therefore the universe had a cause. That's the conclusion of the Kalam, which is why it's really weird that it is prominently used by Craig and others, because even if it is correct and complete, which is questionable given that we have limited knowledge and understanding of this, then the only conclusion we've reached is that the universe has to have some explanation. It tells you nothing about the explanation. It doesn't tell you anything about whether it has to be a thinking agent with purpose or anything. It's like saying, here's a fire. This fire must have some causal explanation. And then saying, fire has to be caused by an intelligence. Now, we know that that's not true because we have lots of examples of fire, and some of them are caused by intelligence. Some of them are caused naturally. The lightning strikes a tree, starts a brush fire, etc. There was no need to presume an intelligent designer behind that, but I'm sure some people would. They would say, everything happens according to God's plan. So the lightning that started the fire was actually intelligently started. So you have no examples of something not started by an intelligence. But when we talk about causality here, normally we would say this fire was started by a thinking agent and this fire wasn't. And in the case of our universe, we only have one of those. We don't have time machines. We don't have any other universes to explore. We cannot say anything earlier than the Planck time even about the physics of this. And yet, to me, that all leads to the answer of, I don't know what caused the universe. And to some theists, they know that it is a necessary, timeless, outside of space-time thinking agent who still exists. And then they extend that further to, and loves us and created the universe, and some of them say it made it look old even though it's really young, and then came down and took human form to serve as a sacrifice to himself, to serve as a loophole for rules that he created. I mean, you get down into the nuts and bolts of this theology when really the only thing that we can say is the universe exists. We don't know why.
Well, I wouldn't say that we have to say that we don't know why. I mean, if God exists, then, and he has personality, if he is a personal agent, if he created this universe as something that appears to be fine-tuned for human existence, and that's not just me saying that as a Christian. I've heard atheists say, well, we kind of have to, we don't know why it's fine-tuned, but it certainly looks like it is, so.
I'm still waiting to get to beyond something beyond ifs. If God exists, and if he did this, and if he did that, then what? What is the then to your list of ifs?
Well, if we see those conditions, then excuse me, then sorry, you kind of derailed me there.
I'm sorry. If universe creating pixies exist, then there would be a universe, right?
Well, you'd have to show that the pixies were metaphysically necessary, and if they were eternal, if they could exist without the universe existing, then they would be in a position where they could bring the universe into existence. If they were all powerful, they would have the ability to.
They don't have to be all powerful. They just have to be powerful enough to create a universe. Why do you have to go to all powerful?
Okay, I'll grant you that.
So I have defined universe creating pixies as beings who are capable of bringing a universe into existence.
Okay. I'll grant you the power, but honestly, when you're talking about the power to create a universe or set of universes, the difference between nearly absolute power and absolute power is really, seems like splitting hairs to me.
I'm not trying to split hairs. What I'm trying to do is say, if we say that there are universe creating pixies, please distinguish why that is less probable than a god.
Well, for one thing, I mean, you can only have one metaphysically necessary being. If you have more than one.
Fine. So there's a universe creating pixie, just one.
Okay. Oh, well, I mean, if you're okay with that, then let's just call him God.
Why? He's not a god. He's a pixie. He's not all powerful. He created the universe and then ceased to exist because he was capable of creating the universe and ending his own existence. As a matter of fact, he exploded his entire brain and essence and became the universe. So he doesn't still exist, at least not in the sense of the way he used to. How is that less probable than a god? Isn't it automatically more probable because it is less powerful than a being that's all powerful and continues? So, I mean, if we've got, here's a being that is just powerful enough to do this, and a being that is powerful enough to do this and a whole bunch of things more, how does the one that can do more become more probable than the one that can just do enough?
I'm not sure I follow you there.
So the extent and number of properties of the universe creating pixie is smaller. It's a smaller set in both magnitude and or quantity and magnitude than this being, which has way more powers, and it is automatically more complex, more robust.
Well, what do you mean by more complex?
It can do more things. It has more capabilities. So, for example, because
I mean, the idea of being omnipotent is actually a pretty simple concept.
No, it's not. That is a big error. It seems simple because you can say one word and you make it everything. But what you're really saying is that everything, the category everything, is simpler than one thing. And that's false. If we have a fire and I say I could have lit it with a match, or I could have created this Rube Goldberg machine that went through 93 steps and could have done 25 other things, and it created the fire. Now, given what we know about the complexity of those two things, which of them is more likely, a match or a massive Rube Goldberg machine? We know that matches are more likely because there's way more of them, and they're far simpler to produce than a Rube Goldberg machine that ends in a match. What you have here is a god who has all of this and really only needs this, the universe creating pixie part. And you're saying that not only have you opted for the God one, that it's more probable without ever showing that it's not a universe creating pixie, but that you're willing to relabel the universe creating pixie as God because it's sufficient.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned Rube Goldberg, because we actually used to do Rube Goldberg projects at my college. Try and make the most complex machine possible, right, to do a simple task. And I have to say, I mean, this whole idea of a universe-generating machine reminds me of Rube Goldberg, that you're multiplying ad hoc explanations to come up with this naturalistic explanation.
No, I never said it was naturalistic. What I did was I took, here's the set of minimum requirements for creating a universe. And I defined something that was necessary and, well, we'll not say necessary. I defined something that was sufficient to meet that minimum set of requirements. And all I said is, it is a universe creating pixie. That is it. And you're saying that it's more likely that there's something which has all of the capabilities of a universe-creating pixie and a whole bunch more. You are the one who is multiplying. I went with the minimal, narrowest, whatever is sufficient to create a universe. And you went with something that is sufficient to create a universe and could do a lot of other things as well.
Like what?
I don't know. It's your God. Can he do things other than creating a universe?
Well, I mean, creating everything that's known to exist.
Can he talk to people?
Well, that would be within the bounds of existence, of physical existence. I mean,
sure.
So yeah, that falls in that category of creating a universe.
My universe-creating pixie no longer exists and can't communicate with people. It has only the properties necessary to create the universe. And your proposed explanation that you think is more probable, despite the fact that the real answer is we don't know, can do those things and a whole bunch more. I mean, I'm assuming, because if all your God can do is create the universe and that's it, then all you've really done is defined God as that which is necessary for the generation of a universe. And that I don't see in any way justifiably gets a God label. There's a specific baggage to the God label, as in a thinking agent who does things and has intentionality, etc. Matter of fact, my universe
part of creating the universe would involve intentionality. So yeah, I mean,
my universe creating pixie isn't actually a thinking agent.
Okay.
It doesn't have any desire.
Why did it create the universe then?
That is just its function. It created a universe. That's it. It didn't know that it created a universe because there's no reason to think that it needed to know. It has whatever characteristics are explicitly required to generate a universe. Now, you need to show what characteristics are explicitly required to generate a universe, and then they all fall into that pixie.
Well, here's the thing, though. I mean, would you agree that the universe had a beginning that we believe, to our best knowledge, was about 13, 14 billion years ago?
Yeah.
Okay. Why did the universe creating pixie, generate the universe 14 billion years ago instead of 15 billion or 20 billion or an eternity ago?
I don't know, and I don't know that it's a valid why question, because why implies that there's some purpose. Now, you could say, what is the explanation for the generation of the universe 13.7 billion years ago? And my answer is still, I don't know. And for anybody who claims that they do know, I want to know why.
Well, but the thing is, I mean, we still have to have, if it didn't come into existence from eternity past.
Why wasn't I born in 1942? Why wasn't I born in 1942 to some other parents?
I'm not following where you're going with this.
Why wasn't I born in 1942 to some other parents?
I don't know.
I don't either. But it seems to be the case that
your parents, conceived you.
When you ask why the universe was created 13.7 billion years ago instead of 15 billion years ago, that's just a silly question to me. And I don't mean that as an insult, silly. I mean it presupposes that there is some possibility or explanation of this. And as far as I can tell, it was required that I be born in 1969 to the parents that I had, and that no other possibility existed for me to be born. And so when we say why did the universe come into existence 13.7 billion years ago? I don't know. I don't even know that it's possible that anything else could have taken place, and actually we're making a mistake, because the point at which the universe comes into place compared to where I am now, that is the time span we're talking about. And that is completely irrelevant, because two other people could have had the same conversation 100 years ago and 1,000 years ago, et cetera. So 13.7 billion years ago is already kind of adding in this overly subjective meaning to the question that is irrelevant.
Well, but I mean, that's why we come up with that God has to be a personal agent, have intentionality.
Well, we're talking about time.
Right.
So 13.7 billion years.
That requires a choice. You have to choose. Okay, I'm going to create. Your pixie has to choose to create something at a certain time.
No, it doesn't. I just said it doesn't.
Why not?
Why should it? So when you say create something at a certain time, you're talking about 13.7 billion years ago. That is time zero in the local time. You have no idea where that is in the other time. If it had created it 2 million years earlier, or 2 billion years, or 20 billion years earlier in the other time, we would still be having this conversation 13.7 billion years from when the universe was created. You have no idea where that zero time is. And in fact, questions of time might not make sense beyond the beginning of the universe.
Well, I would agree that the beginning of the universe marks the beginning of time.
So then by that means, it is impossible that the universe could have been created 15 billion years ago.
No, that's just when time would have begun.
Okay, but that's not the case, because if time began 15 billion years ago, then we would have had this conversation 2.3 billion or 1.3 billion years ago. This conversation is relative to the 0 point.
Right. So we're talking about there has to be there is a 0 point. We both agree on that, right?
Yes.
Okay. So the question is where that 0 point falls.
No, the 0 point falls at this 0 point. If you're looking at a number line, 0 is here, and it doesn't make any sense to why 0 isn't where -4 is. 0 is where it falls.
Okay, but if say we're at the present, and we measure back 13.7 billion years, and we say, okay, that's the 0 point.
Okay.
If we look at our starlight and measure back and say, okay, well, it's actually 15 billion years ago. So the 0 point is 15 billion years ago. Well, then we're adjusting where that 0 point falls. So, I mean, it still comes into play. Even though there's no time before that point, if we're measuring back to that point, then we can still say, yes, the 0 point is further back. And so why was it this time and not another time?
No, the 0 point is not further back. We would just be further forward. And so what you're really asking is, why aren't you and I having this conversation in 1.3 billion years? And the answer is because we exist right now.
But we can still, from our present position, we can still look back and say, we measure this much time going backwards. I mean, that's what the whole idea is.
I had an origin 47 years ago.
Okay.
That is my origin. And you are basically asking me, why isn't my origin 52 years ago? Because it's not. My origin is where it is. Now, we could have this conversation in 5 years, and then my origin, we would be 52 years from my origin. The time, 13.7, is relative to where we are now. It is not. It is not something that is absolute, where if you move it back 2 billion years, you and I are still having this conversation now. We would have had it 1.3. Anyway, we're way off track, and I've gone way over time. My wife is coming to ask me, why the hell didn't you start dinner 3.5 billion years ago instead of when you did?
Thanks, Matt, for joining us for this webinar. It's been a real pleasure having you, and I think we've all really enjoyed having you on.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we look forward to having Beth on as well, talk about her choice views soon.
If you start asking her about time and identity and stuff, she's going to leave. We'll see you all later.
Yeah. If I see you around in the US, or if you're back in the UK, we should do a debate sometime as well. It'll be fun.
Oh, I'd love to try that.
Yeah. Do you have plans to be back in the UK anytime?
I'm hoping to get to England next year, but there's no solid plans. So.
Okay. Well, if you do, drop me an email and we'll see if we can fit in a debate or something.
All right. Sounds good.
All right. Well, take care.